In Mormon history, there are a few events that are watershed moments that shaped the future of Mormonism for generations. A couple of those events are Joseph Smith's last charge and Brigham Young's transfiguration after the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith. To better understand those events, I have a man on the podcast that certainly needs no introduction in Mormon Fundamentalist circles. He is a former attorney and author of many books, both scholarly in nature as well as fiction. His name, Drew Briney. On this episode, we break down Drew's backstory a little bit and then dive into Joseph Smith's last charge and Brigham Young's transfiguration. The historical findings that Drew has discovered are really quite groundbreaking and shed new light on these events that I think most of us haven't even considered. That's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So I just want to take a moment to thank you, the listener. When I started this podcast, I wasn't sure if anyone would really listen. Now, to my surprise, this thing has taken on a life of its own. And that's all due to you, the listener, spending your time here with me, and it means a great deal to me. Now, as a husband and father, I'm keenly aware of how important time is. It feels like there's just never enough of it. So when you are spending your time here listening to this podcast, I feel a responsibility to never waste your time. In that spirit, as this podcast has grown, I feel like I need to do you, the listener, justice. I want to continue to produce good content and upgrade the audio quality. That takes better equipment and better software, and that all takes money. Now, I've tried to advertise, but you'd be surprised. There's not a lot of people wanting to advertise on a Mormon Fundamentalist podcast. I know, surprising, right? Now, if you want to help support the podcast, you can do that one of two ways. The first is go over to MormonRenegade.com and hit the donate tab. There you can make a one-time donation, or you can go ahead and set it up to be a monthly recurring donation. Your choice entirely. Now, option number two, because I'm a capitalist, if you want to head on over to MormonRenegade.com, click on the store button, you're going to find that we've got some new swag out. We got some t-shirts, we have a tote, we have cell phone cases, water bottles, coffee cups. We got a bunch of stuff, and more is going to be on the way. So, if you feel like that's something you could do, again, head on over to Mormon Renegade and check all that stuff out. If you're not in that position to do so, I completely understand. We're all squeezed right now with high gas prices and high inflation. So even if you can't, please keep listening and maybe keep the podcast in your prayers so we can continue to grow, produce good content, and better audio quality. Thank you. Well, Drew, man, we tried for a while and it was kind of hit and miss, but you're here now, and I'm glad that you are.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to finally get around. I'm sorry my schedule's been so awful.
No, man, it's all good. I think that's just life these days. I often dream about slowing down, and it never really pans out the way I'd hoped. So,
yeah, I gave up trying to even comprehend what that is.
I know if I was smart, I would do the same, but I haven't mastered that yet. I always feel like I got to have things planned out, and somehow the less I plan, the better things seem to work. But so anyway, again, thanks for being here, man. I've looked forward to talking to you for a while. There's certain people within fundamentalism, I feel like their name brings a certain amount of recognition and a little bit of veritas, if you will, or authenticity. And I definitely think you're one of those guys. So again, I'm just super excited to talk to you.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
So did you start out Mormon? Were you born into like a Mormon family?
No. I grew up in a town that was there's a church on every corner. But it was all Christian and anti-Mormon, if anything, and extremely violent hometown. And I didn't really have any concept of religion other than some kids went to church and my friends and family didn't. It wasn't until I got to high school that I started looking around and saying, most everybody I know in my extended family spent time in jail and doing drugs and was alcoholic or a drug addict or something. And most of my peers had similar problems. And I just looked around and said, I don't want to live my life like this. You know, I mean, I was probably 14 when I first started introspecting heavily that way. By the time I was 16, 17, I was actively searching for a church that I could, that felt good. And And yeah, my dad, when he found out I'd gone to church, he would ground me and make me spend a whole day weeding the garden. So
Oh,
I
wow.
came from the opposite of a religious family. I got in trouble for going to church. And then, and I don't know if this is too much information, but I went to a band party one day, and I played saxophone in jazz band and in a normal band, and we went to this band party, and the family who was hosting it, from my perspective, was super rich. And I went to their house, and I felt really out of place. It was just very strange, but I felt the spirit there, and I didn't know that. I just was like,
Right.
wow, I feel something here. And I felt awkward socially, so I kind of went to the edge of the yard to get away from everybody. And two sisters that lived there were hiding from everybody and talking. And I was like, the siblings like each other. I'd never heard of siblings liking each other before. It was just shock to me. And soon after that, somebody said, go inside and get a drink. So I went inside to get a drink, and nobody was there except for the husband and wife. And the husband was helping the wife with the dishes, doing something nice for her, and nobody was around. And I was like, he loves his wife. Like, I've never seen they're not faking it. They don't know I'm here. I've never even seen a couple really truly love each other and take care of each other before. And so I said to the girl, I said, would you be offended if I went to your church? And being a faithful Latter-day Saint, she beamed and was like, sure. So I ended up spending a long time having missionary discussions. Back then there were 6 missionary discussions, and you're supposed to do 1 per hour. And I did, in each of those discussions had about 6 parts each. I did one of those parts in about 4 hours.
Wow.
And so I just grilled the missionaries tons with lots of questions, read lots of anti-Mormon stuff to try and get a good balanced perspective, that sort of thing. And sadly, one of the main missionaries who taught me, ended up apostatizing because I pushed him with too many deep questions. So I still feel badly about it. I know it's not exactly my fault. I was just it's just a kid.
Right.
But I was reading everything I could get my hands on. I was so thirsty for the gospel, and I just wanted to know everything. And pat answers did not satisfy my curiosity, So yeah, I guess that's kind of the short version, or long version. I don't know what that is, but
That's
I
a great version. So
went from there to a Presbyterian college. Was the only Mormon on campus, and got grilled a lot. Went on a mission. Went to BYU. Got married, and then accidentally discovered fundamentalism.
so the first part of your story is, gosh, it reminds me of my story so much. I wasn't nearly as willing to become a Mormon up front. In fact, even after I prayed about it and learned that it was true, I felt like I had an out, and I was like, yeah, I still got this. But unfortunately, the missionaries, I think, or fortunately, I should say, were in tune with the Spirit. And because when I took the discussions, I said, no one's going to ask me at all to be baptized. Let's get that out of the way right now. Right? You ask me to jump in the pool or whatever, hit the bricks. I'm done. And
I was reticent like that too, actually.
yeah, I was very hesitant. But looking for a church at a young age, I can identify with that. So my old man, and I was very blessed in this regard, is that my dad was in a lot of ways my best friend growing up. He was just an excellent father, and he passed away when I was 13. And I remember there was, and I won't say what church he was from, but it was an evangelical church. And I remember I asked that pastor that night, the night he died, I said, what happened to my dad? And he said, well, unless he professed his faith in Jesus Christ shortly before he died, he's lost. Now, I had no real inkling of God, but I knew that if God was just and loving, like they said he was, that made no sense.
Yeah.
None. And so that got me started. So I can definitely identify with the idea of looking and trying to find something that felt right. So yeah, I can totally identify. So how did you find fundamentalism?
So I said it was by accident, but it kind of wasn't. My first year that I joined the church, I read the standard works. I read Jesus the Christ, Marvelous Work and Wonder, Articles of Faith, the big fat version,
Right.
and about a dozen total works, including Edersheim and Farrar, Jesus the Christ, and the Jesus Messiah, and those gargantuan tomes.
Right.
I was reading crap like that. Well, I shouldn't say crap, but
I knew what you meant.
Stuff like that.
You're good.
And I just wanted to know everything there was to know, and I continued that on my mission. I was nicknamed Elder McConkie by a number of the elders because because they'd say, well, he knows everything, he studies all that stuff. I even got special permission to keep a couple books because I read extra and cross-reference. So when I got home, when I was on my mission, I was pretty new to Mormonism, so I felt like I was just kind of catching up, and I realized I wasn't, but I still wanted to know everything there was to know, and so I started praying and just saying, God, there's got to be more to your gospel than this. I feel like every general conference is the same thing I've heard forever, and every I'm like, okay, we're talking about the Sabbath. Get your list out, what you can and can't do. That's the lesson. We're not going to talk about anything else. We can't talk about the purpose, or we can't talk about good traditions or something. It's got to do that list. What can I do on the Sabbath? And I was just saying, there's got to be more to your gospel. What is it? And I prayed and I prayed and I prayed, and I searched, and I really couldn't find a whole lot. I did in my senior year of college. I finally found some stuff that Nibley had referenced in some 1970s Ensign articles, or it wasn't Ensign. Anyway, it was about the Book of Enoch. And in the Book of Enoch, in his article about the Book of Enoch, Hugh Nibley said, and Lucifer suffered the threefold ritual reversal of the endowment. Ooh. And I was like, wow, that sounds awesome. I want to know more about that. And he referenced some materials that I couldn't find anywhere. I looked everywhere for these books. And one day I was walking through church archives. I was doing some genealogy stuff. I was taking a genealogy course, and I was doing something. I don't remember what it was. I was walking by this bookshelf, and I just felt drawn. Like, I felt like there was this magnet. I just reached up on the shelf without even looking at it, and grabbed the first book. When I looked to see what it was, grabbed the first book and pulled it down. It was called The Coptic Book of Martyrdoms.
Okay.
I was like, that sounds awesome. I don't know what this is. At any rate, I opened it up. I had no idea what it was. I just felt powerfully drawn to this book, and I pulled it down, and I opened it up, and one of the things listed on it was the Discourse on the Abaton. And I recognized that this was the book that was referred to by Hugh Nibley in this 1970 Ensign or whatever it was magazine article, and I was super excited about it. So I hand copied it word for word in special collections because they wouldn't let you copy it. And then, like, the next week after I typed everything up, all my notes, and formatted it, made it all nice, I found it on the internet. It like barely had got published, like the day after I finished doing it myself. But in the process, I discovered another book called The Apocalypse of Moses. And that book basically is the story of Adam and Eve as told from a restorationist perspective. It's no longer just here's the Genesis account. It's got them praying with arms raised. It's got them doing signs and tokens. It's got prayer circle stuff. I mean, there's several versions of it. I ended up doing my senior thesis on it because I was like, this is like lost stuff. Joseph had no access to it. It's the temple endowment. This is like insane. It's super cool. And the Discourse on Abaton did some of the same stuff, and so did the fall of the Archangel Michael and some other stuff that I found. So I started researching some of these ancient documents, And but I'm still praying. There's more to your gospel. What is it? And so that was part of it. And I went to church one day, and some elder said, "What do you think the order of the resurrection is? I mean, if God's got an order, it seems like there would be like, this is how it's done." And I said, "Oh, I just got this book called Discourses of Brigham Young. Somebody gave it to me. I don't remember where I got it. And Brigham teaches the order of it, and it makes so much sense, and it was really inspiring to me. And so I shared what Brigham said, and I had it in my hand, and it was, and the Sunday school teacher looked at me, and he said, "We don't need to debate how many angels fit on the head of a pin." And I was like, this is the gospel. This is a prophet's teaching about the gospel, and you're dismissing it in this insulting way. I was shocked. So the next week, I don't remember what the topic is, but somebody said something in the elders quorum, and I was like, oh, I just read in the Discourses of Brigham Young. And so I started answering it. And this high priest, who was very well-intentioned, I'm sure, he turns over to me, and he looked at me, and he said, "Elder, if you continue to study that stuff, you're going to apostatize." And I thought, how in Hades' name am I going to apostatize studying the words of a prophet? This makes no sense to me. I had no place to put that. I was like, this is insane. So at any rate, I just continued with this prayer in my heart, saying, I want to know all truth. Where's the rest of your gospel? I don't know where it is. And I was teaching philosophy at UVSC, which is now UVU, but was UVSC at the time. And there was this young girl in my class, and she came to me one day after class, and several days after class, she came to me actually. And she said, "I'm LDS, but not LDS. Do you know what I mean?" And I'm like, I think I told her, because I was, we were on a chummy basis at that point in time. And I said, "I've got a degree in logic that does not compute."
Right.
"I don't have any idea what you mean." And she says, "Well, I'm fundamental." She said, "I'm a polygamist." I said, "Oh, I didn't know there was such a thing today. I thought that ended like 1890. I mean, that's what."
What year would this have been about, Drew?
Ooh, dang. I was in law school. I graduated 2000, 2001, maybe.
Okay.
I'm not, something like that. And at any rate, we ended up talking, and I said, "Well, what else do you guys believe in?" She says, "Well, Adam God teachings." And I said, "Well, the brethren didn't teach that. That was just misquoted." And she said, "I don't know. I just know we believe it." And so anyway, I told my father-in-law about it, and I said, "You'll never guess what I'm at." I didn't know there were these polygamists and stuff. And she says they believe in Adam God teachings. They says, "Well, Drew, I think Brigham might have taught that." And I said, "No, I've read everything the brethren have said, Marky Peterson, McConkie, and I've read all the clearly he didn't teach it." And he said, "Drew, I've got this book by Craig Thulson. Maybe give a look at it." And I never finished reading it, but maybe you probably get through it. So let me know what you think. And I said, "All right." So I've got this book by Craig Thulson. It's I don't remember what he calls it, Adam God something. Have you read that book, by the way?
I have not.
I personally don't recommend it. I might change my perspective now, but when I read it then, I just felt like it was just bashing the church. 90% of the time, quote Brigham, bash church, quote Brigham, bash church. I did not like the attitude. And so I was having a hard time with it. I'm like, I feel like I'm feeling the Spirit when I read Brigham, and I lose the Spirit when I read Craig Thulson.
Right.
So, no offense to Thulson, but that's my experience. And so I quit reading his commentary and only read what Brigham said for the rest of the book. And as I did, I got toward the very end. I'm sorry if this is kind of long-winded.
No,
that's my weakness in who I am. I'm long-winded.
We got all the time in the world here.
So I'm reading this book, And I'm starting to believe that Brigham really did teach this, and that this is actually doctrine and not just speculation. And I'm talking to my wife about it. She's getting panicky.
Sure.
And so I prayed really intently. And I said, Heavenly Father, I don't care what's true. I just want to know what is true. And I'm studying something that people are telling me is the seven deadly heresies, one of the seven deadly heresies. And but when I read Brigham's words and Heba C. Kimball's words and Jedediah M. Grant's words on this, I'm feeling like the same as whenever I was studying the Gospel of Get Baptized. This is like the same spirit here. If I'm being deceived, I need you to let me know in a big way, because I'm not studying this because I want it to be true. I just want to know if it is true. And I want you to let me know. If it is true, make it clear to me. And if it's not, help me know so I can help people not be deceived. That was my prayer. I had no intentions of writing a book, no thoughts about these types of things. I'm just, at the very beginning stages of, studying this doctrine. So I got to the last several pages before I said this prayer. I couldn't sleep. I got up to read, and my wife was asleep. And so I was reading by the bedside, and I had this little desk there. And I didn't realize at the time it was October 8, 1854 discourse. I didn't know that was a big deal or important or anything. I was just reading. So I was reading this discourse, and I had a peculiar experience for me. I've never had another one like it, but when I turned the page, I felt an increase of the spirit. And I noticed right away, I was like, I'm getting excited, And I don't remember how many pages it was, but every one was this distinct, elevated amount of the spirit. And I paused and I said, Heavenly Father, if I'm being deceived and you're trying to tell me you're not doing a very good job.
Right.
Because I was expecting him to say, this is where it's all been misunderstood. I was expecting him to say it's not true, that I'm in the church. That's what I'm expecting, And so I said it like that. I said, you're not doing a very good job if you're trying to keep me away from this. And I just felt more and more of the spirit. And by the time I turned that final page, it was just overwhelming to me. And I knew it was true. And I didn't know what to do about it. And so I went in the other room. I had two toddlers at the time. And I knelt down at the side of their bed. And I had, to that time, the most sacred prayer I'd ever had. And I had no question Adam God teachings were true. I sat there, knelt there. I sat now because I can't kneel anymore because of some leg injuries. But I knelt there and had an open Q&A for hours and just was overwhelmed. And then I said, what next? And, obviously there were challenges with marriage discussions and the next thing was studying plural marriage because my student who taught me about Adam God teaching in the first place wanted to write a paper on the 1886 revelation in the Warren C. Woolley story. And it didn't really fit my class, but I could tell for her it was a moral ethical issue she was trying to understand. So I said, give me some materials, I'll read up on it because I want to know more than you know whenever I grade your paper. That's only fair. And so I did. And then that got me moving on further. And so after that, I wanted to know everything there was to know about Adam God teaching. So I bought every book. I bought Coley Christensen's Adam God Maze, Musser's book, Kraut's book. Did I say Coley Christensen? Craig Thilson's book I already read. There were a bunch of articles and dialogue, accounts and that sort of stuff. And so I got them all. And as I was reading them, I was so annoyed. I was super annoyed. I was like, all of these have these strong biases to them. And frankly, the fundamentalist ones would have all these brackets and these all cap letters and emphases on every level. And I was like, can we just get rid of all of that? I just want to know what Brigham said. I want to know what Heber C. Kimball said. I don't care, Adam brackets, who is God, the eternal Father, Jehovah, and, blah, 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 in brackets, and then, something else. And I'm like, what did Brigham say? I have to go like back here and put it together and read it without the brackets. Right. I was just super annoyed. And the scholars would do kind of the opposite. They're like, well, the Adam God theory, and some people think he modified his views because of this, and there's all these speculative things and very little documentation that actually was in context. And I was like, this is crap too. And so I said, I wish someone would just write a book that had all the quotes without all the commentary, and I could just know what the prophet said. And the instant I thought that, I remembered a quote by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis said, I write books that I want to read, but no one's written yet. And I was like, oh crap, I'm not writing that book. If I write that, I'm going to get excommunicated. And I thought, well, maybe I could write it under a pen name. And I thought, no, because if I write it under a pen name, people will discount it because I wasn't willing to stand by it. But I didn't want to get excommunicated either. So I just said, I'm writing a book. It's going to be all original spellings. It's going to be original sources. It's going to be heavily cited, and it's just going to be one quote after another. It's going to be chronological, so nobody can accuse me of bias. And I'm just going to let the brethren speak for themselves, and I'll do a commentary at the end of each one for anything that's not clear. And the more I studied, the more I compiled, the less I felt a need to expand because it was so clear already.
Right.
At any rate, I didn't get X'd for writing that book, but I sort of did.
You got put on a watch list.
Well, what happened was a bishop came up. Well, I had a sister-in-law, a would-be sister-in-law, who was worried I was going to show up at the temple with all these apostate thoughts, participating in the fundamentalist church. Didn't want me at her temple wedding.
Forget that the endowment is just still riddled to this day with Adam God. Right? Right. I mean, if you know what you're looking at, you get it.
Yeah. Well, and forget just talking and saying, hey, I know you attend apostate churches. Sometimes are you cool not showing up at the wedding? I would have said, yeah, I actually don't have a recommend anymore because I didn't feel comfortable with questions. I'm not going to go, I'll sit in the lobby, it would have been fine. But she panicked about it. And so she called the bishop, and he showed up at the doorstep and started asking questions. And in the process of asking questions, I gave him a copy of the Adam God book. He actually bought it, I think he bought it. And I think he paid for it later or something. At any rate, he passed it on to the stake president to get me in trouble, but then gave me a really nice review of the book. So it was kind of confusing to me. And the stake president brought me in and said, hey, Drew, I don't even know what Adam God thing is. Could you tell me? So I told him, and I said, this is the most church-friendly Adam God book you'll find. Like, there's nothing out there that's going to be as chill toward the church as this.
Yeah.
It's really easy to try and make the church look bad, but I don't go there. I mean, I did cite McConkie twice in the footnotes because I couldn't help it, because he says, Brigham never taught this, and he clearly teaches that exact thing in that. So I footnote it, but I try really hard to be respectful to the brethren because I support them in not teaching it at some level. And I'll just throw a little sidebar there. In Mark chapter 10, I think it's Pharisees and Sadducees come to Jesus and they say, hey, Moses taught that men could get a divorce. What do you say? And we all know that this is a trick question. And Jesus cites Genesis, which, by the way, is a rabbinical way of trumping their argument, because the earlier the scripture shows up in the Pentateuch, the more powerful the argument. He quotes Genesis chapter 2, which says in the beginning, God created a husband and wife, and man will, leave his father and mother and cling to her and then else and that sort of stuff. So he trumps the argument by quoting the earliest thing possible. But in the process, he says, in the beginning, it was not so. Moses allowed this because of the hardness of your hearts. He doesn't chew out Moses. He didn't say Moses gave you a lesser law because he was worried that you would, or he was acting on his own, or he was being a jerk, or he says he took it away because you were being wicked.
Right.
And Joseph Smith says the Old Testament basically was all these carnal laws because of the wickedness of the people, and it was a cursing to them. So I'm looking at this kind of attitude and saying, God gives and he takes away. I mean, if he doesn't want you to have doctrine, he just pulls it away. So and the people didn't want it. They fought and argued against it. So I'm like, at some level, I'm supportive of the church saying, yeah, nope, he never taught it. Or, he speculated, or he was wrong. I don't care. As long as they're not lying. That's where I do draw the line. I do get frustrated with. But that was one of the goals of the book, is I wanted this he never taught it crap to end. It's a lie. Everybody can just get on board that was a lie and get over it. And to say he was speculating, you can call it that now, but he clearly thought he wasn't speculating. It was in the endowment, and they excommunicated people for not believing it, and the whole 12 wanted to excommunicate Orson Pratt for not believing it. So let's get rid of that crap too. That's part of why I wrote the book,
And the first time we see it in the Journal of Discourses, it's at a general conference.
Right.
And it's not a simple, hey, and by the way, Adam's your father. It's deep. He's going in and he is explaining it at length. So when they say he was misquoted, I often say, then you have to ignore context, right?
Yes.
Because there is a ton of context around this. That's not an argument that's going to hold very much water.
Right. Well, and two, I divided up very carefully. It's a different chapter in the book. Jehovah is the father of our spirits. Jehovah is the father of Jesus. We could just say, well, that means Adam's God, right? I mean, but then you're like, well, how is Adam Jehovah? Okay, well, we'll get these other quotes. That's what a lot of fundamentalists did in the past. I'm like, that doesn't say Adam is God. I mean, people have used that to argue that, but it doesn't say it. I mean, this says Adam is the father of our spirits. That's a different section than Adam is God.
Yeah.
I think they mean the same thing, but there's a distinction there in saying Jehovah is the father of our spirits. Well, that's different too. That doesn't say Adam. It does mean Jesus isn't that Jehovah, or at least it suggests it. So I divided all those into separate chapters, and just Adam is God is like 100. You don't misquote 100 times over 25 years. So that's part of why I did the book the way I did. And since then, I mean, that's been 17 years ago, which makes me feel really old. But since that time, that argument is pretty much out of favor. Like, I don't hear it much. I did see in forums for a while. I would just be curious every once in a while, go on forums and Adam God forums, and people would be saying, have you read Drew Briney's Understanding Adam God Teachings? They'd say no. And I'd say, quit arguing all this crap that you're saying. Read the book, and if you still think that, then you can talk to us, but otherwise just stop it. And as much as it was kind of rude and ruthless, I was so gratified that it wasn't, it was no longer this old paradigm. It was, okay, we now have a book that gets rid of this argument. Right. It's just definitive. And if you just read it, you cannot come to any other conclusion and move on. And I found that really gratifying, because I was like, that's what I want. It's not because the argument's sake. I want the truth to be available and out there and beyond dispute.
I think one of the things that's so interesting is that your book comes out about the time we start seeing Mormon history getting plastered on the internet, right? And so this idea that we could just keep it a secret forever, so to speak, isn't going to happen. Not in the information age, not with the internet. Yeah, exactly. It's all over the place. And if we as fundamentalists don't go out there and talk about it, then we allow someone else to frame that narrative. And
Yes.
that, to me, it's so important that we talk about these sorts of doctrines and these things so we get a real clear understanding of what they are. Because a lot of what the anti-Mormons will do is they will take a snippet of it without
Yep.
any context. And
Yep.
so what they're publishing is correct, but not in context.
Yes.
And
It's misleading, but correct.
yes, exactly. And so I just find it an act of providence that your book comes out about the time you start seeing all of this hit the internet.
Yeah.
And so in some ways I was fortunate, because when I was looking at the church, my mom was dead set. I was going to be an evangelical. And when I told her I was studying the Mormon faith,
Shoot.
she went, yeah. She went and had her leader print up a bunch of stuff from the Journal of Discourses, and I took it to the elders, and it blew the elders' minds, and then the bishop, and it blew his mind. And then the stake president said, well, I remember hearing something about this. You need to go talk to so-and-so, who was our stake patriarch, just an old farmer. And he spent hours breaking this stuff down for me. Everything from Adam God, the plural marriage, you name it, right? They
Oh, nice.
blood atonement, but he explained it all. So when I did start really diving deep, I didn't have the freak out factor that a lot of other folks did. I was very blessed in that manner.
That would have helped me a lot, I think. I was always excited, but every step along the way I was like, oh shoot, what do I think about this, and what do I make of this? And I didn't like, they're just as a, for example, there is a book out there that kind of addresses the topic, but you hit stuff about multiple probations. There is no clear, well-organized academic work that lays out what the brethren taught. There's one book that says it's got a lot of quotes, but it's mixed in with lots of other stuff. It's very disorganized. It's got a lot of really good resources, but at the end of the day, I'm like, okay, so what about dissolution? What about second death? What about Brigham's teaching that this didn't apply to sons of perdition? What about, there are tons of topics that you run across, but there's no, where's the book that puts all the stuff together for you? It's
right.
Nobody wants to touch hot topics like that. And that one, I've got a 3-inch binder that's not published, that's waiting for me to go through it. But there are lots of things like that, and people lose their testimonies over it. And it's really easy for anti-Mormons to say, well, look at this quote. And you're like, oh my gosh, what is that? And with changed definitions of simple things like the definition of Jehovah, simple definition, like what is the kingdom of God? And that isn't the church in early Mormon teachings. And so what does it mean when it says that? What is intelligence versus spirit? In the early church, it's taught very frequently. It's a common theme. Today, not so much in the church. I had somebody even today ask me, well, what do you think about these different ideas? And I said, well, the early brethren taught that intelligence was the basic native element of who we are, and the spirit is added to that, and the body's added to that. So what you're teaching doesn't mesh with that. And so I stick with the early brethren. The closer to the fountain I get, the more secure I feel with their doctrines, generally speaking. There are some exceptions when they later grow and say, I didn't understand this fully, but here's more, that sort of stuff. But there are a lot of topics that there just is no definitive resource about it. And so people continue to argue about it until that's out there. And that's what drives my studies. Anyway.
That's awesome. So at what point did you realize, oh crap, I'm a full-blown fundamentalist? Because I remember having that thought.
Yeah. Well, I think I kind of had an intellectual testimony that was sitting there, that I knew certain things were true, but I didn't know where to put them. I was content with I'm sure the brethren know these things, and they took away this light knowledge for the good of the people. And, but slowly that was getting eroded away. But I think what really solidified it for me is I got invited. I looked on the internet to find fundamentalist groups, and man, at the time on the internet, everything was awful. It was scary, awful, not just awful. But I ran across somebody, and he's a 70 in the AUB. And for any listeners who don't know, that's Apostolic United Brethren. It's basically, they consider themselves a break off of the church and honor the church, but don't go to church. Well, the church, I guess. Anyway, so he was a 70. We went over to his house for dinner. He was just going to answer questions for me, because I was like, what else do you guys believe? And, I've been doing all this studying, but I was, kind of curious for somebody who was in it, what they really thought about it. And despite some of the bad press, and I was their attorney for like a dozen years or so, so I know a lot of the bad press is crap. But despite the bad press, they're really very conservative, normal people for the most part. I mean, as a group, they're very, very good people. And so I went to his house and met him and his two wives, and we talked about all sorts of stuff. He just answered all sorts of questions. But I felt the Spirit a lot, and I was surprised. I mean, part of me knew I'm studying stuff, I'm feeling the Spirit, I know this is true. Part of me is like, there's no way this can be true. There's no way there can be priesthood outside the church. There's no way that there can be doctrines so voluminous that the church has rejected. This is impossible. But I was compelled to study and learn anyways. I couldn't let it go because I kept feeling spiritually fed. So at any rate, so I went to his house and answered questions, went with my wife. Took her a while to be convinced to even go. And we left his house and we got in the car, and I started to talk to her, and she said something like, just drive. So I'm like, okay. So we got to the end of the property where he lived, and there's a railroad crossing stop sign. I stopped there, and I said, I feel the Spirit a lot. Don't you? She says, I don't want to talk about it. And I said, if he was living in adultery, we would not feel the Spirit like this. And that's actually when she said, don't talk about it, just drive. So I was like, all right. So we went home, and I felt the Spirit a lot. And I just kind of thought, okay, well, it's one more chapter of my experience, but now I'm having a hard time not believing this is where I need to be going. And she woke up, my wife woke up several times that night, spiritually excited. She's like, I keep waking up and I'm like super excited. I'm like, you can't be excited about this. Polygamy is awful. And so she's like, stop, and then she'd fall back asleep. But this kept happening to her, and that was part of her testimony of her growth too. And I think that was probably the night that I knew I needed to keep studying. I needed to keep learning, and it was going to be a long time before I knew everything that I wanted to know. But my wife wasn't ready, so I waited about a year for her to feel comfortable and be ready to say, I'm ready to get baptized. And even then, she had moments feeling sketchy about it.
Sure.
She grew up pioneer Mormon, and was eldest of 14, and had lots of pressure to stay the course in the family. And most of her challenge really boiled down to, I don't want my family to be disappointed in me.
Right.
It wasn't doctrinal, it wasn't spiritual, it was just social pressure. And I really struggled being patient, waiting for that, because I'm just like, I don't care about my peers. I don't care about social. I don't care about family. I care about God. I care about the truth. And to hell with everything else.
Yeah. I think guys like you and I have a different take on it, because in some ways we've already ripped up our foundation once, right?
Yeah. Yes.
We ripped that bad boy up and we've built it. And this time, going from Mormon to a fundamentalist, well, that's not nearly as drastic, right? We're just going to take it down to studs this time, right? And so this idea of of discovering more, that doesn't really scare guys like you and I think, or at least that's been the experience I've had in talking to people, because
Yeah.
we've been down there once. We're like,
Yeah.
yeah, it kind of sucks at the beginning, but afterwards it's really cool. And for others who have, like your wife, my wife was the same way. They do have those social pressures, right? Those
Yeah.
familiar pressures that, hey, you're going to screw up heaven for us, right?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
that's a lot of pressure. And so as I've gotten older and a little bit more wiser, not much, just a skosh, I found that you got to be gentle with folks in that situation, because
Yeah.
that's a pressure I will never understand. I mean, I can
Yeah.
know about it academically, but I've never been in the thick of it.
Yeah. Well, for me, I have to live authentically. I can't pretend. I can't be in that fake land, where I'm sitting in church pretending to be happy because that's what's expected, and pretending to feel like, wow, that was a powerful discourse, when I'm like, man, I've read hundreds of discourses from the early brethren. I haven't finished the Journal of Discourses, but I've read at least quarter of it. Shoot, I've read more than that, but not a whole lot. Um, at the end of the day, they taught way deeper stuff than what comes across the pulpit now, and I can't pretend like that was moving to me. It's like, that's baby doctrine. I've heard that lots. It's just not powerful, and I can't live the lie.
Right. And
And
that's, yeah, I could, like we were talking about when we were off air here, I was the same way. Only I would hear things that were patently false, and I would be like, leaving church just pissed off, right? Like,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
not right. But it's not their
yep,
fault, because they most of the people who say it honestly believe it,
yes,
right? And so,
yeah,
yeah, I think, Drew, at least for me, once you know, you might be able to suppress it for a while, but at
yeah,
some point the truth is going to have its day.
yeah, yeah. I think everybody has these faith crises along the way, but if you really, God wants us to grow. It doesn't matter what level you're on, and it might not be every week, it might not be every month, but every once in a while, He gives you these really powerful experiences that let you know that you're on the right course. And I worried for a long time. Um, if I can digress for a minute.
Absolutely.
Um, I was under a lot of social pressure that, Drew, you're just really off the deep end, and you're a bad guy, and you're an attorney, and you're living a lie. You've got an oath to protect against to stand up for the law, and polygamy is against the law, and you're living polygamy, and they've got all their arguments. Meanwhile, I produce a pamphlet called I Defy the United States, which is a quote from John Taylor on civil disobedience. But there's all that. I was getting a lot of pressure, and I hadn't had as many spiritual experiences as I was accustomed to for a while. It was kind of a hard time of life. And I went to Zion on vacation, and we were hiking every day for a week. And I've got 15 kids. I think I had 13 then, 12 maybe, I don't know. So a lot, but they're all hiking. And I had a 7-year-old who she was 6, almost 7, but she was hiking with everybody else. And then when we got home to camp, she's playing Frisbee, like with herself, because nobody wanted to play. So she'd throw it, run, chase it, grab it, pick it up, throw it. She played with everybody she could. She's just nonstop. And we got home from the vacation, and she came into my bedroom, and she said, "Mom, Dad, I'm feeling sick." And we're like, "Okay, well, how are you feeling sick?" And she basically described that she was dehydrated. So I said, "Honey, you've been in the desert for a week and you don't stop. Go drink a bunch. You'll be fine. You got a headache and a bit of nausea. You'll be okay." So about half hour later, she comes back in. She starts talking, throws up all over the floor. I'm not a super patient guy. She's old enough not to do that. I'm a little bit annoyed. And so, we just kind of deal with it, clean up. And the next morning, we get up and she's got these purple lines that look like lightning streaks on her cheeks.
Oh.
We're like, shoot, what's that? And I look it up. So I don't know. I'm in a hurry to work. And so I give her a blessing. And I said, I command you to be healed according to the faith of your parents. And I took my hands off and that purple was gone.
Wow.
Now, I didn't know at the time that was purpura fulminans, which is comes from DIC, which is a blood condition that the nurses affectionately call death is coming. I don't know what it really stands for, but that's what they call it because almost nobody survives it. So I go to work and that purple's gone. So I'm thinking God's answered my prayer. It's not a big deal. I've been gone for a week. I got to catch up and it's going to be a busy day. So So I get a call from my wife later and she said that purple's back. And I said, I've looked it up. It looks like it might be a black widow bite. Because while she's talking, I'm looking it up. She said, can I take her to the doctor? I said, well, sure. Just don't let them give you all the hype, make you think it's a big deal. It's not type thing. So she goes to this doctor. He's a family member and extended family, and he's a really nice guy. And I get a call about an hour later. He says, Drew, I know Arlie says that, you don't want me to be blowing this out of proportion, but I'm really concerned about your daughter. And if it was me, I would want her in the hospital right away. I'm like, fine, and I don't know if I spoke right or not, but she just said, you mind if I take her to the doctor, and not the hospital. So I'm like, fine, take her to the hospital, And so I get a call later from the hospital and it's like, Drew, we need to lifeline her to children's primary and she's getting worse. And I'm like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Just don't blow this out of proportion. And the guy says, I can't tell you how concerned I am for your daughter. And so I'm like, do what you got to do. And I was an attorney doing all sorts of stuff. I knew that a lifeline $16,000 medical bill.
Right.
And I wasn't making great money, but I wasn't making horrible money, but 16,000 is a big chunk for, being over cautious. So I later found out that the head doctor at Primary Children's said it was just a drill for her. They expected her to be dead when she showed up based on the information they got. But I had no clue at this point. I'm just, the doctors can be overly reactionary, and I hate that about the medicine profession. So next thing I know, I'm driving up to the hospital and driving my kids back to home while my wife is life-flighting to Salt Lake with the kids and, doing in the middle of my day that I'm really already behind in, this sort of stuff. So by the time I get to the hospital, my daughter is hooked up to all sorts of life support. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? I gave her a blessing to heal her and it was honored. And now it's worse than ever, and I'm feeling pretty bad about myself. And I'm getting all this social pressure. Drew, you're a fundamentalist. You got to be a wicked guy. You got to repent. Got to come back to the church. God's not going to honor you anymore for going astray and living adultery and all this stuff, And I am really struggling. I'm like, man, maybe I'm off somewhere. I don't know. And I'm praying really hard. Where am I off? So a few days are like this, and I asked my father-in-law to give her a blessing, and he's fundamentalist too. In fact, he's ruling all red sun. And he gave her a blessing and basically said, bless the doctors, figure out what's wrong with you. And I love the guy. He's a good friend of mine. I was kind of pissed.
Sure.
I was like, that is not a faithful blessing. That's a cop-out blessing. I don't care about the stupid doctors. I care about God. I've seen God's power. I had a boy, I gave him a blessing and he couldn't speak at 6 years old, and he immediately started talking when I gave him a blessing. And I've seen people cured of cancer, and I've seen skin grown back, minutes or hours after a blessing from burns and from brown recluse bites. And I've seen all these, lots of miracles. I believe this is a real thing. And the doctors, I don't care about the doctors. You're going to give a blessing, do it right. Joseph at one point said, you've been in the gospel long enough. You shouldn't be relying on the doctors. You should just be giving a faithful blessing, and they should just be healed. That's where we should be at. To be fair, Joseph gave a blessing after that, and the person wasn't healed. But that sentiment was heavy in my mind, and I just felt awful. I'm like, if this is my faith, this is my fault. I don't have the faith to heal my daughter, and I'm having faith crisis, So about a week and a half into the hospital, I've been praying really hard. And by this point, my daughter has meningitis of the brain, which can kill you. She's got lung failure. She's on lung support. She's had kidney failure. They're functioning at like 10 to 20%. She's got liver failure. It's functioning 10, 20%. She's got DIC, which basically is blood clots. That's what that was, that purple stuff.
Oh, I got you.
So that's like a scab underneath the skin. So to have that gone away from a blessing is a miracle all by itself. But I didn't know what that, learning as we're going along. She's on the verge of heart failure. They're really worried her heart's going to go. And meanwhile, she's got these purple blood clots all over her body, and her toes are turning black. And I'm upset, and I'm standing at the head of her bed, and I'm stroking her hair. And there were other people coming in and out, so I couldn't just give a blessing, but I was like, I'm ready to give a blessing. I need to give a blessing now. But people were coming in and out, and I didn't know how to. Nurse, will you please quit tending to my daughter?
Right, right.
And family member, please go away. I want your support. I just don't know what to do. And I had this really strong impression: give a silent blessing. I'd given plenty of silent prayers, but it never occurred to me to give a silent blessing before. It's not that novel of an idea, but it just never occurred to me. So I was like, okay, I can do this. And I'm already at the head of her bed, and she's got all this equipment all over her. She can't, she's tiny with all these tubes and face mask over her.
Yeah.
She can't function or hear, and she's having hallucinations and stuff when she is awake. And so I give her a blessing, and I basically said, I command your brain to be healed. I command your heart to be healed. I command your lungs to be healed. Command your kidneys to be healed. Command your liver to be healed. I command your blood to fix it. I don't remember what I said. Work properly and quit clotting when it's not supposed to. And in the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Nothing happened. I just stood there, and she's asleep still. And I'm like, and I go back to work. And I feel kind of awful on the way to work. It's the busiest day I think I've ever had in my whole life today, still. That was like 10 years ago. And I got a call from my wife about 8 p.m. And she said, I've got an update. Well, an update to that point had been like, oh, her liver failed today. Oh, well, the kidneys were doing better, but now they're way worse. And that's what an update was. And I had been so busy, I'd literally get the instant, not like 10 minutes, but like the instant I get off the phone, I got an email, I got to respond to that. I got a text message, respond to that. Talk to my secretary, get a file, get it out, sign something, do something, instant I'm done with something else is on my desk. It's like that all day, no break. I think I worked through lunch and everything. So it's 8 o'clock at night-ish, and she gives me this phone call, and I'm like, oh yeah, right, my daughter's in the hospital. What's your update? And she said, well, a little bit after you left, the doctors thought they'd give her a test trial off of the lung support to see how she'd handle it. And they're moving her up into normal room. She's no longer in emergency care. And they took off 10 of the 12 forms of life support. The only ones that are on there still is antibiotics.
Wow.
And her numbers are imperfect, but they're they're like, they can't explain why they're so much better.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, happy news, Um, and that it just, I was so excited to go see her, and there continued to be some challenges and some problems, but those things were out of the woods. And my wife, who had been, I don't want to portray in too negative of light, but in my perspective, she's constantly kind of saying, you're wicked and all this stuff's wrong with you. And and her family, of course, is like, you've got to quit being apostate, and this sort of stuff. But my wife was more just being critical, and you're not spiritual like you used to be, or whatever, that sort of stuff.
Right.
And that had been really hard on me. She called me up and she said, Drew, because this healing is like huge. Like the statistics of her surviving were like 1 in 5 million. I calculated it from several doctor conversations, because I just wanted to understand where we were at. And at one point I asked the lead doctor, what are the chances of her survival? And she said, every moment, flip a coin. We don't know why she's alive. And so then all of a sudden she's on the mend, and we're later learned she was born without a spleen and all this sort of stuff. And but my wife had been, in my estimation, really critical of me. She said, I was just reading, I think it's Alma 8, I could be wrong, sorry, 3 Nephi 8. Whatever, that's probably a wrong citation, but anyway, it says, he performed mighty miracles, therefore we knew he was a man of God. And so she kind of apologized to me for being hard on me. And I was like, wow, that's awesome. All this good news, and family healing on top of what's going on with my daughter. And meanwhile, she'd been babysitting all my other wife's kids and being a real gem that way. At any rate, that kind of experience I've had multiple times, although that was the biggest one for us. But it really demonstrated the power of God is still there. The priesthood is a living, breathing thing, and he honors that for a purpose in him. And he's still looking after us, and he's not saying, well, here's a wicked guy and I'm not going to answer his prayers, and here's a wicked guy and I'm not going to honor his priesthood because he's an apostate. And it was very faith affirming, and I've continued to have experiences like that. And I wasn't having those anymore in the church, and that's not because it's not the church's fault. It was just I wasn't growing.
Right.
I wasn't getting closer to God anymore. And I think those types of experiences are kind of missing in the dialogue about fundamentalism.
They absolutely are. So this was before I was a fundamentalist, but gosh, there's so much of what you say that I can personally relate to. Me and my wife, we adopted a set of twins from my sister, and we were living in Maryland at the time, and she was back in Boise, and she'd given birth to these twins, and they were just in horrible shape. She was on meth while they were in utero. I mean, it was a horror show. And we got the call while I was in Maryland. Do you want them? If you don't want them, we're going to split them up because we're going to have to.
Yeah.
Their medical problems are so overwhelming. We don't feel comfortable giving them to family, anybody else other than family, giving both of them. I mean,
yeah.
So we moved back and we adopted them. But my daughter got the worst of it, where her large intestine was where her small intestine was supposed to be. So they actually had to go in and like rework her stomach. And she didn't eat for the first 6 months of her life. She received every bit of her nutrients through a PICC line. And we would try to feed her and it would just come right back up. And the doctor, when they replaced the PICC line for the 3rd time, he said, look, here's the deal. If this gets infected again, we're going to jerk the line. Well, when this gets infected again, we're going to jerk the line. And it's not like we weren't keeping her clean. It's just a matter of time before bacteria gets in there.
Yeah.
He said, it's sink or swim time. And he said, I'm going to go hiking this weekend because and it was the first time I saw a doctor cry. He said, because I can't be put in that position anymore to have to do this because I can't say no to her. And so we took her home, and sure enough, within 2 days, it was infected again. And they jerked the PICC line, and it was the peak of the housing market. And for land surveyors, it was insanely busy.
Yeah.
And I called my buddy who I worked for. I said, look, I'm not going to be in. I'll bring the laptop home and do some work from home. But she was just getting worse and worse. Every time she tried to eat, it would just come right back up. And the home health carriers came in. And of course, our daughter's dropping weight exponentially. And she said, look, she said, this probably isn't going to end the way you want it to end. And she said, I think tomorrow, if she hasn't gained much more weight, we're going to call in hospice to at least make her comfortable. And I just remember just feeling defeated, Drew. I had given her many blessings and feeling like, why is this not working? I'm failing. Something's not right. And I remember, like, literally, it was 2:30 in the morning. The home health care nurse was going to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning. And we were living in Meridian, Idaho at the time. And I remember we had these bay windows that looked out on this empty field. We were the last phase of the subdivision we were in. And our daughter was fussing really hard because she was hungry. And my poor wife, she'd been up with her for so much. I said, I got her, honey. I got her. So I took her downstairs and I sat in front of those windows in our living room, and I just had her on my chest. And I just remember saying the prayer to God, look, there's a lot of things I can take. I can take a lot of stuff, but I can't take this. I'm not strong enough to have to bury a kid. And I started to kind of doze off. And I've never shared this story except with maybe a handful of people before. But it was about 3:15 in the morning. And it was as close to an audible voice as I'd ever heard. And it said, she needs something heavier. And in that moment, at 3:15 in the morning, I knew exactly what she needed. She needed mashed potatoes. And I know that sounds dumb, but I ran upstairs with her in my arms, and I get my wife. I'm like, we need mashed potatoes. And she's like, what in the hell are you talking about? It's 3:15. I was like, trust me, I know what I heard. And so she's like, well, we don't have any. I'm like, take the baby. I'm going to Winco. I'll be back in a minute. Winco is just right around the corner. So I was making like the fat kid in gym class and hauling butt because, man, I was in a hurry. And I get home and I start making them. My wife's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, just trust me, right? Just trust me. I don't blame her because I must have looked like a madman. And we mixed these up and I said, help me get it soupier, right? But not too soupy. And we did. And it was soupy enough it would actually get into a bottle. We had to cut the nipple a little bit in the bottle, but it was enough that she could get it out. And she drank probably 4 ounces. And then she just like went limp. And I went, I just killed her. That was the first thought I had. But she was still breathing.
Uh-huh.
She was still breathing. And they were sleeping in our room at that time because they had all sorts of monitors and we wanted to be close. And so I laid her down, and that whole night I didn't sleep. And about 6:30, she woke back up and she was hungry, but she hadn't thrown up. And we fed her again. And same thing. She kept it down. She went right back to sleep. Hour and a half later, the home healthcare nurse shows up and she's gained 4 ounces. And she's never looked back. Sometimes I think we look at blessings that don't work as failed blessings. Or let me rephrase that. We see them as not working,
Right.
We see them as not doing what they're supposed to. My first thought when you were telling me your story, maybe that first blessing got your daughter to the hospital.
Yeah.
Who knows what that looks like had you not given her a blessing, right? And maybe the blessings that I perceived failed for my daughter were simply preparatory for the final part. I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
they
Well,
maybe they put me in a revelatory state of mind, so I was at least open at hearing when communication did come.
yes. Yeah. Well, and like with me, it's similar. The principle I saw was he did something that I could manifestly and undeniably say he just answered that prayer, but she's dying anyways. Why would he do that? What's
Right.
going on here? So I know he's answering prayer, but I also know he needs me to step up. He needs something to happen here. Otherwise, my prayer, because I don't say that in blessing. I don't think I've ever said that in blessing. I bless you to be healed according to faith of your parents. I've never said that before. I haven't said it since. I don't think. It's just maybe I have, but I don't know. It was, but to come out like that makes me stop and say, okay, my faith needs to step up. I need to do something because it's not good enough right now. But I wouldn't have thought that without that blessing. I don't know what I would have thought right now, because that changed my life forever. But I probably would have thought something different. And it did prepare me to introspect. It did prepare me to be desperate and to say, okay, I need to take some accountability here, because that's what I was inspired to say. And, that pushed me. So I didn't see it as a failed blessing for very long. And
Right.
even when I did have some of that perspective, I was looking at it saying, well, but he that was a miracle. I mean, I know what that is. That was a scab underneath the skin and it's gone in an instant. That doesn't happen. That was a miracle, but why? What, and the part of the story I didn't tell is when everything was done and she's quote healthy. I'm making it a lot simpler story, that her toes were still shriveling. And I thought, I'm such an idiot. I forgot to pray for her toes. If I would have done it at the time, she'd be healed all the way. So then I'm like, okay, I need the spirit of healing upon me again. And I just kept praying for that for weeks until finally the doctor said, if you don't cut them off now, we're going to have to cut off at the hip. And I was like, I either got to get faith or we've got to do it. And we finally swallowed, and that was a horrific experience. But
Oh yeah.
At the end of the day, everything else was healed. And so I was like, for a while, that was again my failure. But I was like, no, if that was meant to be, that wouldn't have been forgotten. If that was, it's not like I healed her anyways,
Right.
If I screwed up in the blessing, that's on him, and he could have fixed it. He didn't.
Right.
So anyway,
I think as humans, and especially as men, we tend to take those things on a little bit, and I think it's healthy in some respect. I want to say that I think that's part of manhood, probably a little bit
growing.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I'll say this too, because we do have that and it is good, there's also a downside to that, which is sometimes we have this idea of how things are supposed to look, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know the ends from the beginning. Hell,
Yeah.
we're lucky if we get a glimpse of what's in the middle, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we tend to want to tell God how things should be, right? And we don't see what happens on the other side of the veil. And we don't remember what we promised we would do when we got here. And so sometimes I think we take undue failure upon ourselves.
Yeah.
Because what we view as a failure now, well, that could be a great big blessing in the end. Did you ever hear that proverb about the Chinese village wise man?
I've heard a couple about Chinese village wise men.
So there's a village wise man, and this boy, he's been wanting a horse his whole life. And finally the boy gets a horse, and he goes to the wise, and people go to the wise man. They say, "Isn't it great? He got a horse." He said,
So
"We'll
maybe.
see. We'll
Yeah.
see."
Yeah.
And the boy gets bucked off the horse, and he breaks his arm, and they go to the wise man. They say, "Isn't it horrible? He broke his arm." And he says, "We'll see." And then a war breaks out, but the young man can't fight in it because his arm's broke. They said, "Isn't it great that he doesn't have to fight in the war?" And he says, "We'll see." And I think sometimes, not sometimes, I think a lot of our lives are much like that, right?
Yeah.
We have
Yeah.
a desired outcome, but we don't know what all that desired outcome entails. And we don't know
Yeah.
what strength someone will gain from adversity.
Or what connection, or yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
So how'd you get into writing books? I mean, obviously the Adam God doctrine, was that kind of the catalyst, if you will, for writing?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah. Let me think. I'm trying to remember what came first, because it didn't occur to me till this very moment. So I took a creative writing course in high school,
Okay.
and my teacher told me, she said, Drew, I'm starting a new course. I want you to take it, because I really think you've got a talent here, but you don't know because you haven't explored it. And when you're a teenage kid, somebody tells you that, you're like, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
I took her course. I loved it. I loved creative writing. And so I was interested in it. And but I just never really pursued it, because it's a lame career, right? You're never going to make any money. That I grew up super, super poor, and
I did too.
I was encouraged. They're like, the only way you're getting out of this poverty is if you get good grades. That was before, the modern thing where that changed. Back whenever I was a kid, that was true. You want a good job, you better go to college for the most part. And so I got a law degree, and that's what you're going to do to make money. And I was the very first class graduating where we weren't kind of guaranteed good jobs. There was a smaller percentage of people getting good jobs than ever before and getting jobs. And it wasn't the easiest path for me. And my very first set of things was all about how to prosecute polygamists, stuff like, seminars I'm making. Writing Adam God teachings, I was really putting my neck on the line, because I'd gone to a seminar and they said, we're not really prosecuting polygamists, generally speaking, but if you find anybody that's taken an oath of an office, a police officer, a mayor, a judge, an attorney, we're going to nail them to the wall. So writing Adam God teachings is not saying I'm a polygamist, but it's kind of hinting.
Yeah, you're tipping your hand a little.
Yeah. And so it was intimidating from that level. But I just felt like I had to. And then the next book I wrote, sorry, I'm exploring a little bit in my head while
you're good.
I'm asking that question. Next book I wrote was Silencing Mormon Polygamy. And that was kind of an accident. I wasn't intending to write that book either. I was asked to teach an elders quorum. It was a large quorum class about the 1886 revelation to John Taylor, and from an attorney's perspective. So I was like, okay, I know almost nothing about this. So I went and got Max Anderson's original manuscript that he did before. His manuscript's like this freaking big, and his book's like this. It was really thick, and there's a lot of good information in it. And from what I hear, basically Marky Peterson said, get rid of all that crap, it makes us look bad, and this is the book you're supposed to write. And it was tiny and crap. Meanwhile, Brian C. Hales is writing his stuff against Lawrence E. Woolley, and Lynn Bishop wrote that book 1886 or something. And so I just got everything I could and started reading it and started doing this elders quorum class. Well, I had notes that I was using to teach the class. And after class, I kept having men come up to me and saying, "Can we get a copy of your notes?" And I'm like, "Sure." Next thing I know, I've been requested and produced 500 copies of my notes for that class. And I'm like, this is insane. Like, people don't know very much about this and they want to know a lot more. And so at this point, like every week, I'm going to Kinko's and having my notes bound, you know, and I'm like, this is stupid, you know, and frankly, my notes weren't that good, which is annoying because Brian C. Hill's got a copy of them and responded online as if this was my final published book. And these were just notes. And so he's like, there's no citation for this, but he says this. And I'm like, oh, come on. And he knew better. Like, I talked to him before he responded to it. I said, respond to Silence and Mormon Polygamy. That's the book. The notes are just for Eldest Quorum. Yeah, but when you put it out there, it's your problem. So I'm like, whatever. So the notes weren't tight. They weren't good, but people were desperate for them. And so I said, I need to write this book. And so I did. Geez, see, I told you I was long-winded. So
no, you're good. You're good.
So here's my situation. I'm at work and I've decided to write this book and I've got all my notes and I put everything together and I'm broke. I'm like desperate behind at the office. Like, people think all attorneys are rich, but we have a lot of expenses. And I was just a solo practitioner because if I practiced with somebody else and got found out as a polygamist, it would ruin their career. And that's not fair of me. So I just stayed on my own, and it's super hard to do that. So I'm behind, and I'm getting about $6,000 behind at the office. Like, I need $6,000 now to pay my bills. And I'm like not making my bills. So, but I don't have any work either. Like, nothing's coming through my door except for this $100 gig or whatever.
Right.
And so I started off my day and I'm like, all right, well, I'm just going to write this book then. And then I'll by afternoon, I'll work on what I've got. And that's plenty of time. So that's what I was doing. But every time I started working as an attorney, I would get distracted. Next thing I know, I've got all my notes out and I'm writing the book again. I'm like, what the heck? And my mom, who's my secretary at the time, she's like, Drew, you know, you realize how far behind we are? Get your butt in gear and start working. And I'm like, oh, yeah. It's, you know, that's only going to make me $50. And she's like, everybody penny counts. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It's not enough. You know? And next thing I know, she gives me the file, I'm working on it. Next thing I know, it's outside of my desk, half finished, and I'm writing a footnote and I'm cross-referencing something and fixing something that's not quite right. And I can't stop. And this happens for weeks. Like 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks, I don't know. And I'm at this point realizing I need $6,000 now. It's not for the whole month. It's just nothing's come in. I need it now. I've got like 3 days or something, you know. It's probably more like a week when I had that realization. But I'm almost done with the book and I finish it and I pray. And this is how I am with all my books, but this is the only one I've had experience like this. I'm like, I'm done. So the book is finished. Do you want me to change anything? And, you know, and I've had experiences doing that where he's like, this section you came across really biased. You need to go talk about the other side here more. Or you didn't address this detail and it should be in a footnote at least. Or whatever. I just get direction like that and I'll go fix what's not right. So I'm waiting for him to tell me this ain't right, you know? Instead, he says, I want you to add 3 chapters to the beginning. And I was like, I need $6,000 in like a week now or 3 or 4 days. And I'm done, you know? But at the same time, I'm like, that's a great idea. I hadn't considered even throwing that stuff in there. It provides a great context for all of the academic stuff I just did. And it makes it more of a book instead of a paper. I mean, it was long, but you know, it doesn't read as this academic treatise. And I put it in there and it felt so good. It came together super fast. I'd already had all the research done for something else. Put together really fast. And I said the same prayer again. And he said, you need to add a chapter on Elijah and the priesthood and in this area. And that's just a label. Frankly, I would title it differently if I was going to do it now, but there was a quote that talked about the priesthood of Elijah. So I called it that. And it was done. And I put it, I had my own publishing company. So I just started printing and getting things ready. And I had a client walk in the door, and he basically, in a nutshell, said, I've been super successful. I don't know why, don't know what I'm doing, but I've been told to see an attorney and get my business structure set forth and my estate planning. And I want, all this sort of, and he described this elaborate, huge amount of corporate structure that he wanted for all these different businesses. And the more he talked and the more estate planning he needed done, was a lot of stuff. And he threw down $11,000 that day and
Wow.
said, I want all this stuff done, get it done. And I was like, holy flip.
Yeah.
And,
holy cow.
And the manner of stuff that he wanted, I was able to work through pretty quickly. I mean, relatively speaking. And my secretary was able to do a lot of it. So I was able to take care of, getting the binding done and hiring the person to do the hardcover and, just stuff like that, and take care of all those ends. And I had extra money.
Wow.
And so I started feeling pretty supported in what I was doing.
Oh yeah.
And then I had some spiritual experiences where I said, I want you to write this book and I want you to do this. And then that kind of quit. And meanwhile, I started writing science fiction fantasy for a totally different reason on the side. And that's just that between the two of them kept me very, very busy. And I felt for a while like, okay, I put out those 5-7 books, whatever. It depends on how you call it. I did 2 volumes of Ancient Near Eastern Law and Law School with John Welch. And does that really count? And what, 50-page paper on Deuteronomic law in the Book of Mormon, and whatever, does that count? So, but I kind of felt like I'm only really interested in writing a couple books that aren't urgent. I didn't feel like compelled to write like right now. Like I've done ancient Christian traditions and beliefs on the nativity and how it completely changes how we see the birth of Christ and the circumstances what happened. And I'm like almost done for 10 years, but haven't published it. And I did a poetic version of DNC compared to the original with massive amount of annotations, which I had for free on my website, but my website's down. So awesome stuff there. And I'm really interested in Mormon reincarnation teachings and dissolution, second death, and all those types of teachings and eternal progression. What did they really teach? You got a lot of rumors, a lot of out of context things, and a lot of speculation, but nothing's really well organized and definitive. And I wanted to write that, but it's just kept getting distracted, At any rate, so I moved to Missouri, and there's some people there that are Mormon, but it's not Mormon. I don't know. Anyway, there's a small group of people that I associated with, and some of them were kind of mainstream fundamentalists, and some of them were Josephites, but didn't always really believe what Joseph taught either, And
Right.
one day I was talking to somebody, and I mentioned a quote, some teaching about Jesus being our elder brother. He said, Jesus is not our elder brother. And I said, what are you talking about? Joseph clearly taught that. You believe in Joseph. He said, Joseph never taught that. It's unscriptural. It's not doctrinal. And Joseph never would have taught it. And I was like, what? But then I looked and started finding some quotes for him, because he said, you can't find any. And, to me as an academic, I'm like, okay, I've got a database I've been working on for decades. I'm going to find it and give it to you, And I was shocked. I found very few quotes where Joseph clearly said, Jesus is our elder brother. I only found 4. And it was a quick search. I didn't go through my entire database and I didn't search diligently, but I was shocked how few times he said it. The definitive one I found was in the King Follett recording of the recording of the King Follett discourse by this man's great grandpa that wasn't published in Words of Joseph Smith, but was in the CD-ROM version. So, and it was awesome. It taught other new doctrines too. It's like, just stuff like this. It's, it's like, wow, I haven't found all this stuff in one quote. It's pretty awesome. But anyway, the reason I mentioned that in context of your question of what got me into writing is I started saying, I don't know the teachings of Joseph as well as I thought I did. What I know is the whole housing of Mormon fundamentalism, but who taught which part of it, it didn't matter to me because I was looking for truth, not this is what Joseph taught, this is what Brigham taught.
Right.
So that put me on a trek to write 5 volumes of Joseph Smith teachings that are not in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith. And so that's what I've been working on now.
So how long have you been working on that now?
I don't know. So are you familiar with the book Remembering Joseph? It's by David McConkie. I highly recommend it to anybody. McConkie says openly, just in spirit of his uncle or grandpa or dad or whoever he is, Bruce R. McConkie, well, this is obviously an incorrect teaching because it goes against what the modern prophets teach. So Joseph didn't teach this. Don't include that in your book. But other than some of that, it is a fabulous resource. The book is pretty thick. But the CD-ROM version, I'm guessing, I don't know, I would guess it'd be 900 pages if it was published. And it's just people telling their experience knowing Joseph Smith and what he taught. Well, I think this was about 2 years ago. And I said, this was this huge spiritual experience for me reading this CD-ROM. I mean, it took forever.
Right.
And I'd marked up the book already. And then I decided, I'm going to use the CD-ROM to create some other resources, database and stuff like this. And as I did, I was like, there are tons of teachings where Joseph's teaching stuff that aren't on the TPJS. They're not in WJS either. Why has nobody published this? Why do we care so little about the restoration that we don't have a complete teachings of Joseph Smith? We think we do. George Albert Smith compiles it, and Joseph Fielding Smith publishes it, and they did quite a bit of changing in it, which I was surprised to find out because Words of Joseph Smith, basically says he didn't really change much. He mostly didn't, but sometimes he really did a lot.
Right.
I'm going to do a whole volume just on the changes. And at any rate, so it's a tremendous resource. I highly recommend it to anybody, but it wasn't what I wanted either, because there's a lot of, well, Joseph had, the flat forehead and pronounced eyebrows, and just all these stupid descriptions. And sometimes people just say, yeah, I met this Mormon prophet guy, and he seemed like a nice fellow, and that's it. Well, that's nice from a historian's perspective, and I'm happy because I've got a degree in history, and that's kind of an obsession of mine. But at the same time, I want to know what he taught. At the end of the day, what he did day to day is inspiring, but what he taught and those principles, that's the whole reason we're here. I want to know everything there is to know about the gospel.
Right.
And if he was spouting off someday and said something stupid and somebody wrote it down wrong, fine. But I want to know what he said. It was going on in his head and he said it just off the cuff, fine. But it tells me where his mind was, and that, he would have only thought that if he believed this. I'm that kind of a guy. So I wanted to have all of it in one resource. I thought this isn't going to take me that long to go through and just kind of cut and paste, Oh my gosh. It's taken me probably 200 hours just to put citations into the footnotes and format and trim the story that's 3 pages long down to the 2 paragraphs where I actually taught something, and modernized spelling or whatever, that sort of stuff. And I'm only a third way through. Or half.
How many volumes do you figure this bad boy's going to be?
So I think that volume, oh, and this is just like journals and reminiscences. I'm not talking about times and seasons, Joseph Smith papers, Council of
Right.
50, Kirtland Council minutes. I'm thinking just that one is 400 to 600 pages when I'm done.
Cool.
I don't know, and it's not like those are unpublished. They've been in higher madrasas. They knew the prophet, Joseph Smith the seer, remembering Joseph. Some of them are only in remembering Joseph CD-ROM. But for the most part, those are not like available as teachings,
Right.
Because they're not reliable, because they say deep crap that the church don't like.
Right. Right.
and so anyway, I started writing this book. I should say I started compiling this book, and just putting tags in. Here's Zion's camp, cholera, complaining, gratitude, tags, of what's going on here. Besides an index, so that you can kind of get a flavor of what's going to be there, in that section, and kind of have a more modern, something of a searchable database that I can use for my index, so that it's not just by trigger words that maybe don't show up. It might not say Zion's camp, it might say on the way to Zion, but I know from context it was a camp. It might say while we were en route, we got cholera because men were griping and complaining. But it doesn't say Zion's camp, so Zion's camp won't show up there on the data, on the index. So
Right.
tags to do all this stuff.
Oh.
It's just taking an enormous amount of time. And I get to this section about the Transfiguration of Brigham Young, and I haven't finished compiling all of that. What's in the book is awesome. I was so inspired, but what's in the CD-ROM is like way more. But I think that's looking like just the accounts themselves in a 6x9 format is something like 60 pages.
Holy cow.
Just on the Transfiguration, I think last I checked, it was something like that. I've been spending so much time on this ended up being a separate book, because I'm like, the Transfigure Brigham Young isn't really the teachings of Joseph, right? But Brigham's talking all about the last charge, which was Joseph's teaching that led to that event, although I don't think it's really been academically studied from that perspective. So I'm like, I'm just going to write a separate book on this.
Well,
so that's what I'm working on now.
But I think that's an important one, right? Because that, if that's not grounded in reality, if that's not true, if we can't go back and look at it, then that leaves a whole lot of room for other things to come in, right? Whether that be the Strangites, whether that be, and this isn't a slam on the Strangites, I'm just saying, that maybe he's the rightful heir. Maybe it does stay in Kirtland, in Nauvoo and Kirtland with Emma and her kids. Maybe it does, there's all sorts of ways it can go. So that moment in history where there's kind of a vacuum in Joseph's absence, that's a huge part of Mormonism that I think has to be explored a little bit better.
Okay. Okay. Let me tell you. Well, if I may.
Yeah.
I started. Okay. Well, I came to a couple realizations as I was researching this, and I can't give it to you right now. It'll be in the book. But I read a quote of Brigham Young, and he basically says, "You all heard Joseph's last charge when he said, blah." This is in front of, there were 5,000 saints in the morning. He's saying that to the crowd out in the afternoon. We don't know what the count is. I can't imagine if there were 5,000 in the morning listening to Sidney Rigdon, that there weren't at least 4,000 showing up to listen to Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon and decide where the church is going to be. It's a few hours away, 6 hours or something. I can't imagine it being too different, but let's say there were only 3,000. He says, "You heard." Well, how in Hades' name did all those people hear if it was March 23rd to March 26th in a council of 50 minutes meeting?
Right.
Where did they hear the last charge? Ehat recognizes that it was repeated in a prayer circle because Bathsheba Smith gives a record of Joseph giving a last charge in a prayer circle. But it treats it as an echo. In the Quorum of Anointed meetings, in whatever that, what's this series? It's Anderson and Bergera, but it's the Quorum of Anointed documentary history. But then the second one is the Nauvoo Endowment Company, and the third one is the history of the temple. You know which series I'm talking about?
Yeah.
In there, it says Ehat suggests that this meeting give this, and they quote the certificate of the 12 and so forth. But I'm reading the Ehat's research and Quinn's research, and it's all about Council 50, Council 50. You read LeBaronites, it's all about Council 50. Benjamin F. Johnson said. But I know that there's a lot of quotes out there, and I'm thinking Brigham says everybody heard it. So how do I put these two together? It doesn't make sense to me, but it's inspiring to me. It makes me rethink stuff. And so this is kind of what happened. So first of all, I grab all the quotes and I start putting them together. And I organize them by who said it and not chronologically, because we don't know when some of the stuff was recorded and when it was published. And that's the problem that we don't have with Adam God teaching. So I'm doing it differently. But anyway, I'm formatting and putting it all together. And at the end of it, I realized something really, really unique. And I started putting this all together on multiple levels. And these two really are very related topics: last charge, Transfiguration, Brigham Young.
Sure.
They seem very unrelated. But anyway, I put them together. I got about 70 accounts. Now, Ehat and Quinn said they found 100 quotes, last charge of quotes. Okay. I keep finding stuff that it's not really a last charge quote, but it kind of is. And I think those count in their 100, but I'm looking like reminiscent accounts, there are roughly 70. In my count that I put in the book, a couple of them are almost not reminiscent. It's kind of, you just have to read each one to see individually, but sometimes they don't read as a reminiscent account. It's just a commentary on something that happened that was the last charge, but never says
Gotcha.
So.
Gotcha. Yep.
And at any rate, so I think I probably found all the same ones Ehat Quinn did, minus a couple that maybe don't matter. But I just looked, I created this long table, and I asked several questions for the table. First question I asked was, what's the name? But when was this account given? Because I want to compare. The 50-year reminiscent account is not the same as something that happened 3 months after. It's just, right. I don't care how good your memory is. It's just not that awesome. And then I asked the little Baronite question. Who was given authority, the 12 or the 12 and somebody else, or somebody else? You know what I'm talking about?
Sure, yep.
Okay, maybe for some of your listeners, LeBaronites basically say Benjamin F. Johnson was a member of the Council of 50. His very first meeting was the last charge, and he basically says Joseph gave the power to lead the church to the 12 in connection with the 50, and they weren't supposed to do it alone, and 12 are wicked. I'm being flippant, but that's kind of the idea of it. And the next question I asked is, where was the last charge given? And this is a no-brainer that no academics are really asking, but this is an important issue, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then, what were the keys Joseph gave? Were the keys to the kingdom or the keys to the church, or both? And today in the modern church, that's the same thing. Right. But in Joseph's day, it was not the same thing.
It was absolutely a separate thing.
It was 100% different. Yes. And then the third question was, does it mention the fullness of the priesthood or second anointings, the account? And the last one, which has been completely mocked by some scholars, is, were women present? And I'm finding in footnotes, like in the Quorum of Anointed, there's kind of a footnote says, we don't know for sure this was a Quorum of Anointing meeting. It might have been a Council of 50 meeting, but Ehat thinks it might not have been, so we're going to put it here because it makes our book thicker. I'm kind of exaggerating, but that's kind of how it reads to me. There's no discussion or explanation or, why is this really here? Or what's the argument this should be here? I agree that it should be there, by the way, but it's not there. In the Council of 50 Minutes, there is no discussion of, there's no mention of a March 23rd or March 26th meeting with the last charge. It's not there. The March 23rd didn't happen. That's the date that Orson Pratt offers. And the March 26th account, which is probably when it happened, says nothing about it. And Ehat's got some fabulous speculations as why that's the case. But why is it not there? Well, you get a couple footnotes, but that's about it. So of those 70 accounts, I looked at each of those issues, and I haven't, frankly, since I compiled that, made sure my notes were absolutely perfect, compare them with the original quotes. So I could be a bit off on the numbers, but I think there are only 3 accounts that clearly say Council of 50, and the only person to say the authority to give was Joseph gave the authority to the 12 in connection with the 50 was Benjamin F. Johnson. That's it. He's the only one. Now, that's a 50-year reminiscent account. But on the other hand, I've got 35 accounts that mention fullness of the priesthood, 7 more that suggest fullness of the priesthood, and well over, I think, 50 accounts that say the 12 were given all the authority and power, and about 12 accounts that say the 12 were given the power in connection with another quorum. Which other quorum? Not clear. One says high priest, one says a council, and probably that sounds like Council 50, but it doesn't say. And some say the holy priesthood, men in connection with the holy priesthood, and other vague statements. Like, who? Men,
Right.
important people, not all the general authorities of the church. These are some of the buzzwords that are used, but it's saying it's not just the 12. So there is some substance maybe to what Benjamin F. Johnson said, but when you've got 70 accounts, 50 of them say the 12, 12 of them say the 12 and somebody else, and only ones that say 12 with 50 are one person, 50 are reminiscent. It's not very compelling.
Right.
From a historical evidentiary perspective, that's not compelling. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. So then I start adding some of these other things because I'm reading through the original sources and asking more questions now, because I thought people have a lot of feelings about D. Michael Quinn. But he was a good scholar, and maybe he messed up on some of his stuff, don't we all? But he's a really nice guy. I felt really honored when I made his Christmas list and he sent me a Christmas card. he was going to quote my book Apostles on Trial extensively and asked my permission. I'm like, of course, thanks for the formality, but that's an honor. So
yeah.
And then he died before he published that book, which I'm really upset about because I was going to write the same book and stopped because he was writing it. I thought he'll do a better job.
Right.
Anyway, so anyway, he studied this and he had studied this, and I thought, I'm sure they've been down these rabbit holes. But I know what it's like. Sometimes you have this perspective of something and you just don't see past it. So I started reviewing some of these things, and there are scholars out there who mock the idea that Joseph gave the last charge in front of the Nauvoo Legion. There are 3 accounts that say Joseph gave the last charge to the Nauvoo Legion. They say, oh, morons. It was the Council of 50. They don't know the difference between the Legion and the Council of 50. And these people were confused, and because Ehad and Quinn said it's Council 50 meeting. And that's the truth. That's what it is, But I'm like, we've got 3 accounts. One of these accounts, the guy says Joseph stood at the frame in the mansion house. So he's in the doorway. He remembers watching him in the doorway. That's the kind of
lends speaking to a large crowd, right? I mean,
right. Well, and besides that, as a historian, that's the kind of detail when somebody remembers that, that's not them bravadoing, right? I mean, we've got John Lee saying he's at the Transfiguration of Brigham Young. He was on a mission and didn't get back till the 20th. That happened on the 8th. He probably was just saying that to make people like, I knew I was back in the day when Brigham was transfigured, and man, that was cool. And I don't know what he's thinking, but he wasn't there,
Right.
But when you start making this, he says he's in the frame of the mansion house. I was standing in the front in the street leaning on the picket fence with my brother. And the Nauvoo Legion had this call and response with Joseph about would they die for each other or not. And then Joseph gives the last charge. That's not the kind of detail people make up. Typically speaking, as a historian, that's a dang good red flag, good quote. But oh, they're stupid because they can't remember the Nauvoo Legion from the Council of 50. I mean, these people are carrying around bayonets and guns in the street. The guy remembers, right?
Right.
Okay. And then they're like, well, this woman said that she heard the last charge, but she couldn't have because it was a Council of 50 meeting. She must remember because her brother was in the Council of 50 and blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? We have 8 separate women saying they physically heard with their own ears the last charge. One of them was Bathsheba Smith. Okay, so if we go to the prayer circles in the Quorum of Anointed meetings, and we check up all the times that Bathsheba Smith shows up at prayer circle meetings when they could have given the last charge, it sounds like maybe that was the last charge date. She only shows up in 3 meetings. One of them is for her second anointing. That's just not a good venue for second last charge. And the other is William Law's excommunication, getting kicked out of the quorum, basically. It's not maybe excommunication, it's kicked out of the Quorum of Anointed. And the third one sounds like maybe that was the last charge meeting. That was December 23rd, 1843. Well, that's an early date for prayer circle we're not expecting. Ehat speculates the 17th because of Orson Hyde's comments, but she's not there. So to say, okay, well, it was given to the Quorum Anointed, so that's why some of the women showed up, but the other ones must have been mistaken. Well, guess what? There were 7 other women testified they were physically present, and they weren't in the Quorum of Anointed when Joseph was alive.
Wow.
So they had to hear it in a public meeting. So now we have Wilford Woodruff starting mostly later in his life, but starting, early on, he starts testifying about the last charge, but especially at the end of his life, he says, Joseph gave this discourse many times. And further, he gave it to the relief societies, plural, not just one meeting, but multiple times. There's a woman, I can't remember her first name, but her last name was Morgan or Mon or something like that. And she said, and from then on, that was Joseph's beat. He was preaching the last charge. She says like it was a topic he just talked about a lot. So Wilford Woodruff, sorry, one more quick thing.
Okay.
Wilford Woodruff says hundreds or thousands of you personally heard Joseph preach the last charge.
Wow.
And historians have been like, Wilford Woodruff's bravado. This is, reminiscent account because he's biased in favor of the 12 and he doesn't remember right and all this sort of stuff. But I have at least 11 separate venues documented. And there are several more that say he said it oft repeated, many occasions, numerous times that Joseph gave this discourse. There's at least one when a child, Joseph Smith III, was present for the talk. We've got at least 7 women who heard it, who weren't in the Quorum of Anointed. So that had to be a general conference meeting. People say it was at a Bowery. It was at the stand east of the temple. And we've got one person saying he was on the way to Carthage jail. And you've got another who says he was preparing, he went and fetched water for Joseph to get water for the endowments. And he said, I want you to be my witness. I'm giving endowments to the 12 this day. And that was the day Wilford Woodruff says he gave the last charge to the 12 was when he gave them their endowments. Now that's got its own little issue going on there. But I've got at least 11 different accounts. We know women were present. We know a child was present. And we've got people testifying it happened over and over and over again. So all of this scholarship saying it happened at one Council of 50 event is rubbish. There's no way this was a one-time event. And that changes the entire history of the Transfiguration of Brigham Young.
Well, yeah, and that's where I was going. Let's talk about the ramifications of this, right? If what you're saying and what you're finding is fact, what does that mean? What does that mean for us as Mormons as a whole?
Right. So this is where even a good memory can get screwed up. So I read Ehat's thesis probably in like 2002 or 3. I don't remember. And by the way, just lest I'm misconstrued, I'm dedicating my book to Andrew Ehat. I think he's an undervalued scholar, and he's done a monumental service to Mormonism. I really admire and appreciate him. But I read his thesis earlier on. What I remember as I was studying Mormon fundamentalism was this. And this is not accurate. There's a twist on this, but this is what my memory was telling me. Ehat says, isn't it remarkable that Brigham Young's argument as the successor of Joseph Smith says, hey, guess what? I have a secret priesthood. I got these secret ordinations from Joseph at these secret meetings in a secret quorum that none of you know about. It's called, well, never mind. We just won't talk about that. But Joseph gave me all this extra authority with the 12, and we should lead the church. That's basically his argument. I got secret priesthood from secret meetings. Isn't it remarkable that all the saints followed him? I mean, you've got the Stringites, you've got the Rigdonites, you've got the Cutlerites, you've got, Lymans, following Master Lyman. All these people, fine, but they were so small compared to the vast majority of saints who follow Brigham Young. And I thought, man, that's fascinating. That the whole foundation of the Western Church is based on these secret meetings and the secret priesthood, the second anointings, right? That's what Brigham Young's talking about, his fullness of the priesthood. So that's stuck in my head for a couple decades, and I ruminated over it. I just thought that's fascinating, and for all the airtime, how evil, wicked secret meetings are in the mainstream church today, that's what was going down. The quorum of anointed was not recognized by the people as a quorum because it was not in the scriptures. It was not in a revelation. It was not publicly acknowledged. And frankly, most people just didn't know about it. And the same was pretty much true of the Council of 50. There's no, thus saith the Lord, organize you a quorum of high priests, and they shall form a high council, and they'll judge people. And there's all this revelation telling us about the high council. You want to read about elders? Here's the elders quorum. Shall have this many 96 members, and then there'll be, and same thing with deacons, and all the way down to priests, and all these lesser important things have revelation. But the whole foundation of the church is based on a quorum that's not acknowledged when Joseph dies in any way, shape, or form. So that's an amazing observation. Now, that's not what Ehat said. When I went back to find the quote, because I was dedicating the book to him and trying to say, this is what inspired the book. What he actually said is, Rigdon was told that, he didn't have the fullness of the priesthood, and he should know better than to try and ordain people to something he doesn't have. But at the end of the day, Ehat says, the quorum of anointed was never intended to be a leadership quorum that was guiding the church. It was Joseph's hope that everybody would receive their second anointings and blah, blah, blah. Totally on board with what he said. But that's not what happened. Brigham Young said, the 12 should lead the church, not because the Doctrine and Covenant says so. It doesn't. Not because that's our job. Doctrine and Covenant says it's not their job. Not because we were ordained in 1835 and, we're given, did I get that date wrong? Anyway, it's a quorum of 12. But because we received a fullness of priesthood in the secret meetings that you guys don't know about. That's why we're running the church now. And Joseph said so in the last charge that he gave it a secret meeting called the Council of 50, right? That's kind of what it boils down to. And so I'm reading Ehat's thesis, and the irony of all this is just blowing my mind. I've got my father-in-law saying, Drew, you can't have this 1886 meeting where there's these secret ordinations that might have been given, or this priesthood injunction that wasn't given to the church. And if it was revelation, it wasn't sanctioned by the church, and, all this sort of stuff. And so this really sticks out in my mind, that the whole church is founded upon this. Now, how does what I've been studying change that? Well, here's how it changes it. And just quickly summarizing again, well, let me backtrack to one more thing real quickly. Orson Pratt presents a draft certificate of the 12 apostles, which really there are only 9 that were present, saying, we were at this last charge meeting in the Council of 50, where Joseph anointed us and gave us authority to lead the church, basically, and the kingdom. He presents this certificate, which is now available on josephsmithpapers.org. I think it's on, might be on the March 25th, 1845. That's when the Council 50-minute meeting was. But at any rate, you can find it on the josephsmithpapers.org. He presents this draft certificate with their testimony about the last charge. When he presents it to the Council of 50, 3 objections are made. First of all, Brigham Young said, Joseph never anointed us in that meeting. And I don't care what people think if they understand where we got our authority or not. So that's Brigham's objection. Orson Pratt says, I wasn't present at that meeting, but I was present at a similar meeting when he gave the last charge, and he said all this stuff and, gave this authority to the 12 and so forth. So I could testify to that, but I wasn't at the Council of 50 meeting. I was on a mission or something. I don't remember. So that's significant because now that's a different venue that he's referring to. And then Lucian Woodworth, which frankly is not like this massive pillar of Mormondom that everybody knows, like Heber C. Kimball or Jedediah Grant or somebody like that, but he's in the Council of 50. He's also in the Quorum of Anointed. And Lucian Woodworth says, I don't think it's appropriate for you to be talking about this stuff, Orson Hyde, in the Council of 50 meetings. That information belongs in a different quorum. It's not appropriate for you to talk about it here. And it's talking about second anointings.
Yeah.
It's talking about fullness of priesthood. He's clearly referring to Quorum of Anointed. But he's saying, Orson Hyde, you made a mistake. That meeting was not a Council of 50 meeting. That's what all three of those brethren are saying. And so it gets dropped and that certificate never gets signed. Well, this is interesting. So why is Orson Hyde wrong? Well, or how did he mess that up? Well, Quorum of Anointed meetings, guess where they're at? Red Brick Store, most of the time. Where were Council of 50 meetings? Red Brick Store. Who was present for the last charge? The 12 and a few other men. Hiram Smith and Joseph Smith were for sure mentioned. And guess who's in the Council of 50? Same men.
Right.
And guess what the topic was? Is the same topic. And frankly, probably there was a last charge given in the Council of 50 meetings. I firmly assume and believe there was. But there was also one in the council when Joseph gives the endowments again, or second anointings again, along with their appointment, and he gives the last charge as Denison Harris Lott says. Or is it Denison Lott Harrison? I don't know, whatever. One of those hard names for me to remember. But at any rate, it's easy to see why Orson Hyde messed that up. And he gets corrected by three brethren in the Council of 50 meeting saying that was not a Council of 50 meeting. Wow. You're mixing things up. So with that acknowledged, we've got at least 11 venues acknowledged in these accounts, at least. I think when it says multiple times, we've got a cottage meeting, we've got on the way to Carthage. There are a lot of the Legion, the Relief Societies, there are a lot of places that are just not even secret priesthood meetings. But so with that perspective, at least 11, we've got at least 8 women testifying that they were there, and we've got more that are brought up as saying it was in this general conference. It was like outside, and I heard him talk, outdoors by the Bowery or something. When you look at all this, I think we need to consider Wilford Woodruff's testimony really carefully. The hundreds or thousands heard that testimony, and when you look at Brigham Young's rhetoric to people, he doesn't have to explain all the details. He's just saying, you guys remember the last charge? The fullness of the priesthood and these things. And they're like, oh yeah, we remember hearing about that. Why? Because as Morgan testified, that was his burden from then on to preach about, the authority being given to the 12. Joseph prepared the saints, and hundreds or thousands of them recognized that Joseph knew and designated the 12 to be the leaders of the church before he died. That's how this is different. And Brigham Young acknowledges that in the Transfiguration accounts. Specifically, and this is one of those things I'm like, how clear was it when I read it? Because it's been, the last 80 hours of my research has all been last charge. Transfiguration is just in my mind is, how this affected it. But Brigham Young was pretty, in my mind, and I tend to be picky about these things, he's very clear to say, you all have heard the last charge. You heard Joseph give us the authority. That's a very different perspective from, I got this secret priesthood from these secret meetings that you guys don't know anything about. That's why you should believe me. And so because it's not compelling, now there's this miracle that happens. It sounds like Joseph Smith to the whistle in his tooth being kicked out from the beating he got when they tried to poison him. And, all of these types of descriptions are given of Joseph Smith or Brigham appearing as Joseph Smith. Well, that just sounds like miracle or polemics if you're cynical, right? It's this political retrospective
Right.
conspiracy, right? But from this perspective, if we look at it, I don't think you can argue anymore when you see all the accounts together and they're all published without the framework of Council 50. I don't think you can look at this anymore and say the saints didn't know what to do. I think Wilford Woodruff was fond of saying we didn't understand what Joseph was saying. We thought he was going to take a break for a while. We thought he was just going to, take a vacation and then come back and fix everything. And I'm sure the saints thought similar things. Some of them thought Joseph can never die. He even said in one of his last discourses, some people have thought I could never die. And there was a time in my life when my promises weren't fulfilled. That was true, but it is no longer true. I'm an any man, I'm subject to death. He prophesied of his martyrdom. I think I probably got 40 accounts of it. It wasn't like he thought about it and said it to two people. He talked about it many times. In fact, frankly, I think a lot of those times were probably last charge accounts if we review the record and if we want to start piecing things together. But at the end of the day, you can't say it was a Council of 50 minute only. I think it did happen there. It also happened in the Quorum of Anointed multiple times. I think it happened in the Relief Society multiple times. Happened with the Nauvoo Legion. Happened in personal cottage meeting. It happened in an endowment session with the 12. And on it goes. There were multiple times that he did this. And so when Brigham Young stands up and says the 12 are supposed to lead the church, it's not a surprise. People are like, oh yeah. Just like Brigham Young. He said, first, did Joseph take the keys of the kingdom? No, he gave us all the authority that could be had. His grief overtook him for a minute. And he's like, duh, I remember now. And so the saints just needed reminded. Now, there's an objection to this type of approach. And I think this is why part of this has been missed. Frankly, I kind of wonder. I'm like, you've got 8 women testifying they were there. Why do you blow this off? You've got 3 people testifying Nauvoo Legion heard this. Why do we blow that off? It's just, we love Ehud and Quinn, and they're awesome, and we trust them, and that's great. I do too, but everybody makes mistakes. So I just think it's been carelessness that we haven't seen this before. But at the end of the day, the saints were reminded, not taught about the last charge. That's the big difference. That's the huge difference. Now, I want to point out one more thing. I see this in modern scholarship a lot, and it really annoys me. People are like, well, how come at first they only gave this much of an account, and then later it's double the size, and later it's just triple the details? They're making it up. I've seen that a lot with Lawrence C. Woolley stuff. There's a lot of critique for him. But first of all, look at this. The Gospel of Mark is long esteemed by all good scholars, minus a couple Catholics. Book of Mark was written first. Guess which book of the Gospels is the shortest? Mark. And guess what? He ended the story too early, and it made people upset. And so people added the last couple chapters to it. That's not Mark who wrote that. So it was even shorter. Guess which book of the 3 synoptic Gospels is the longest? Luke. Guess which one was written last? Luke. This is common. It happened with the first vision. It happens with accounts of the restoration of the priesthood. This has happened lots of times, and scholars are constantly saying, ooh, I see conspiracy here. They're making stuff up, and then they just keep adding crap as time goes on. Historians, good historians, know better than to fall into this trap. And I'll give you a really easy example. If the year is 2020, and I say, that mean-haired man, that mean orange-haired guy made a mean tweet today, and I tell you that, you don't say, gosh, is that Barack Obama? No, it's Biden. Who's mean orange-haired guy?
Right.
I don't have to tell you. It's so obvious. And if I say that orange-haired guy made a mean tweet this morning, I don't need to explain to you that's Twitter. I don't need to explain to you social media. I don't need to explain to you internet. I don't need to explain to you wokeism. I don't need to explain to you that he was a controversial figure because he didn't like the radical left. I don't need to explain to you about the socialist and communist movement among the Democrats. You know all that stuff. I just say the orange-haired dude made a mean tweet, and you're like, oh, what do you say? That's all you ask.
Right.
But if I give you the same statement in 2050, there are a lot of questions. What the heck are you talking about? Who's the orange-haired guy? Well, he's the president. Which one? Donald Trump. Oh, yeah, I remember him having orange hair. And why do people think he was mean? Well, there was this thing called wokeism going on. And you have to explain more stuff as time goes on because people don't know what it was.
Right.
That's normal. And in history, you don't say this is conspiracy because now he's explaining who Donald Trump is. He didn't say it before it was Donald Trump, but now he's trying to make us think that's who it was. He just, who it was. And this type of thing, you should still have a skeptical eye as a historian. I'm not denying that. But neither do you assume conspiracy because there are more details later, because guess what? People ask questions and they say, hey, you were at the last church, right? Well, what else happened, Grandpa? You were there, but what else did he say? Well, let me think. I don't know what I told you all before, but this is what I remember now. Well, what about this? And so he starts recalling, he's answering more questions, and he adds more details. And you're like, we'll write that down, damn it. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to what you were saying about as time goes on, maybe you get some more details. The other thing to remember is that sometimes when you're that close to an event, you tend to just write down the things that you find pertinent in that moment.
Yes, you
right?
don't understand how big of a deal it is until later.
You don't understand how big of a deal it is. So maybe by the time we get to Luke not only has his perspective, but he has other people's perspectives, and he has the gift of that perspective to say, you know what, I didn't think that was as important, but gosh, I'm going to add that because now with hindsight, I can see what a big deal that is. And so in a lot of these things where we talk about in early church history, it may have well been 2,000 years ago, because when we look at where we are now, I tend to feel like because of the tech we have, 100 years ago feels a lot longer now than it did back in the 1800s. And so that gift of hindsight, I think, makes a big difference.
It does. And frankly, Luke copied Mark word for word in places. Luke copied Matthew word for word in different places, and so he's with some stuff, he's like, that's just spot on. And he didn't do that for their whole accounts. He's like, no. This is what happened. And he has some contrary details because he remembers it differently. Well, it doesn't mean they're making it up. He saw it from a different angle.
Right.
In the Transfiguration accounts, one of the women says, she was sitting down breastfeeding, so she couldn't see what happened. And she said, is that Joseph's voice? And her husband's like, yeah, but it's Brigham talking. And one of the boys, he can't see. He's too short. He's like looking through the crowd, and he's like, Dad, is Joseph resurrected? And his dad's like, no, it's Brigham, but he looks like Joseph. And and so everybody's got their different perspective of what happened and what's going on. Other people are like, I didn't see anything. Well, it was a crowded room. Were you in the back? There are lots of different reasons why somebody might not have had the same experience. That's just, it doesn't have to be conspiracy. I think it's super helpful to have a healthy skepticism of details. So that exists. But I think you got to be careful why you're skeptic. And it's easy for non-trained historians to write about crap and get things wrong because they don't know how common that sort of thing is in history.
Yeah. And how you explain it is exactly why history is so important. I've been on this kick for a long time with American history, just how important it is we get the history right.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing is happening within the church right now. If we don't get the history right, where America is now, in terms of its political stripes, that's where the church will soon to be. And I say the church, I mean the LDS church, but also I mean fundamentalists, right? If we don't get the history right, we will be in the same sort of bad situation we find the country.
Yeah.
And so what, and it has huge implications, Drew, when you start talking about validating what Brigham Young said, when you start talking about the multiple accounts of the last charge, well, that puts squarely upon the Westward Church, that branch of Mormonism, a very, very undeniable and verifiable stamp and seal of approval from Joseph the prophet.
Yes. And I say that from a perspective of thinking, as a fundamentalist, that the LDS church suffers a certain degree of apostasy.
Yeah.
And at the same time, and this is a different branch from what we were just saying, at the same time, you look at Benjamin F. Johnson's statement that, well, he gave the 12 authority in connection with the Council of 50. Well, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that we can use to push that, to substantiate that. But I've got 12 other accounts that are vague about what quorum it was. One specifically says high priests. One says men of the holy priesthood. I think a lot more scholarship needs to be looked into to see what are those quorums. And frankly, with 35 accounts mentioning the fullness of the priesthood and another 7 suggesting that all the keys to Joseph had, or something like that, that's in context sounds like the fullness of the priesthood, because that's what all the other accounts say. And besides, that's what he was preaching from the stand. He's trying to get the temple built. When you look at all of that, is he really saying, in conjunction with this council of quorum of anointed, which 75% of the people who are in the, shoot, I'm going to get this backwards. I don't remember, 75% of the quorum of anointed was in this council of 50 or vice versa. I think it was quorum of anointed were in council 50 of the men. That's a lot of crossover.
Yeah.
And it makes more sense from a teaching of what the fullness of the priesthood perspective is, that they hold all keys and are able to fill any position in any situation. It makes sense that's what he was talking about. Now, he could have been referring to other quorums, and it's possible Joseph was in different quorums saying, I want the 12 in connection with this high council, which that's not one of the examples. I'm just making that up. I want the 12 in connection with this council, the high council, to lead the church. And then another venue he says, I want the 12 in connection with this quorum of elders to lead the church. And later he says, I want the 12 in connection with the council of 50 to lead the church. And I want the 12 in connection with a quorum of anointed to lead the kingdom and the church. That very well could be like trying to say, I didn't establish all these quorums to throw them away. Right. I want you to work with all of them. Now, I'm not saying that's what he meant. I'm saying that's a possibility of what he meant. And if we look at this evidence holistically, and we don't have to discard all of Ehat and Quint's research. I'm frankly super grateful for all that they've done for this research, but I think we need to expand upon it. And frankly, to honor what they've done, we need to build on it, not just regurgitate it. But I think at this point, with all this information, we now have a duty to stop and say, what quorum did Joseph mean? And did he mean that he really wanted them to have keys and authority to lead everybody in fighting between the quorums as to what's the right thing and bicker about it? Or was he just saying, I want this, what I've created, to stay all together and not to be discarded? If that's the case, then we say, well, where's our Council of 50 today? Dang it.
Right.
And where's our quorum of anointed today? Okay, great, we go to the temple, right? We're endowed. Great, we go to somebody's house to get endowed, or whatever your situation may be as a fundamentalist. But where's our quorum? And if Joseph's saying, I don't want these things broken up, that shows to our own level of disorganization. So when you were asking earlier, what's the implication of this? I think it's huge. I think it's bigger than just saying, well, the saints were right to follow Brigham, which I personally think is pretty evident from the record, from the last charge record. I think it's bigger than that. I think it's Joseph saying, look at the foundation I've created. You need to build upon this and don't disband it. Don't throw it away. Keep it together and keep, this is my life's work. Don't lose it. Everybody's the law of entropy, right? Everybody moves towards apostasy as an organization. That's just what happens. Don't let this happen. Hold it together. You've got 12 men now, not just one. You got 12 holding things up together. And if they kill you off, Joseph said multiple times in the last charge, ordain somebody else to fill your spot. You've got the power. They'll never be able to take this power from the earth. So here's the statement of Joseph Smith prophesying the fullness of the priesthood will never be taken from those. Multiple times he says this. I've got other accounts of him saying the priesthood of Melchizedek will never be taken from the earth. Another account saying the priesthood of Aaronic priesthood will never be taken from the earth. Those are significant statements, all in the last charge context. And all by themselves basically say, okay, these break-off groups who say we only have high priests, or these break-off groups who say we only have, the elders is the highest priesthood that's left, they're off. The fullness of the priesthood is out there. Can you find it? It's not going to be taken from the earth. Where is it? And I think those are significant repercussions of this understanding.
Absolutely. And I can't help but feel that in some way, all of Mormondom in some respects are, I think, trying to get back to that. Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it feels like we're stumbling in the dark trying to figure it all out. And I think that's why research like this is so important, because sometimes, well, let me say this first. As human beings, we have this natural tendency to look for the newest, brightest, shiniest thing to fix what's going on.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, though, we got to look back. We got to say what was intended, what was our starting point, where are we at now, how do we course correct to get back there?
Yeah.
And that's sometimes what I feel like we miss when we read history.
Yeah.
Sometimes we read history because it's interesting, and it is fascinating. However, I think sometimes we need to read it with the eye of like a map. Where were we when it started? What was the destination, and where are we now? Oh crap, we're off bearing. How do we get back on?
Yeah.
And I think history provides those answers.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to do with that understanding out of God teachings, is to say, what did the brethren teach? And at the point I'm like, I don't know who Ogden Crowd is. I don't know who Joseph Musser is. I don't know who Cully Christensen is. I don't care. I don't know who Brigham is. I know who Heber C. Kimball is. I know who Jedediah M. Grant is. What did they say? What did Joseph say about it? And I mean, there's all sorts of topics all by themselves there, but that's what I found was, from what I learned from that experience, what I continue to do when I do research today is the same exact thing. I thought there are only going to be 10 quotes that say this, and I'm going to have to compare to these other sections of the book in these other remote places to help people understand what he meant from context, because people don't teach those things anymore, But what I found was, when I put all the quotes together, it was pretty clear. I didn't have much to say. So I just left my analysis to be these tiny little paragraphs at the end of a long chapter. And I find the same thing with this. If you read all of the last charge accounts, forget what Quinn wrote, forget what Ehat wrote, forget what Bradshaw wrote or whoever, just read the original accounts all together. And are you still convinced that this is a one-time event? If you do, you're dumb. There's no way that was a one-time event. And then you just say, well, what does that change for me? What does that mean? What are the repercussions? It's the same question you were asking earlier. And I fully expect, and I hope, that when people read all of them, they'll come up with some, observation I totally missed. And 5 years from now, somebody's going to say, Joe, I'm taking lunch. What's your problem? You totally missed this detail. And I'll go, oh, I got to do a second edition. That's awesome. I totally hope that happens. And I wrote in my introduction to this book, I'm like, I'm abandoning all the erudite academic conventions that I've been pretty diligent with in previous books. And that's not totally true, but this is me inviting conversation. This is me inviting, let's talk about this. Let's open discourse about these things. This is not me, let me prove my point. This is me saying, let's go back to the original quotes, like you're saying, and see what we messed up. And okay, so what? So women were there. What does that mean? Well, it wasn't a priesthood thing. Okay, that's a starter. What does it mean the kids were there? It means he wasn't shy about talking about this in public. What does it mean that he gave it on at least 11 occasions? It means he wanted everybody to know. This was not a secret. Right. This was not part of the secret quorum, the secret ordinations and all this. This was a Joseph saying, okay, I'm in the middle of doing all this. I'm getting death threats. I want everybody to know this is what I've been doing, and follow the 12. They'll teach you whatever you need to know. That's what it was. And more. I don't even know what more is, and then, putting that in context, the Transfiguration of Brigham Young suffers similar problems, although it's maybe less interesting academically. It's inspiring to read all the different accounts. It really, that's to me, the gospel is about miracles. To me, the gospel is about awesome things that happen. And if somebody's poo-pooing a miracle, I'm so sorry for them that they haven't seen him. I've had way too many spiritual experiences to blow off anything. There are accounts of Joseph Smith rising from the ground while he's talking. I haven't seen that happen, but guess what? I have seen enough stuff. I don't doubt it. I mean, I don't know it's true. I'm not saying I got a testimony of it, but I'm like, possible to me. Why not?
I've thought, well, ever since I joined the LDS Church and started studying Mormonism in depth, the one thing that's always come back to me is that if we're not having those experiences, whatever they are, right? You and I talked about a couple that we had. If we're not having those, we are not sampling some of the best and sweetest fruit that the gospel has to offer.
Yes.
Amen. And if you really read Joseph Smith, and until I'm proven wrong, I will go to my grave singing this song. You get the feel out of everything Joseph says when he's talking to people is, I had my experience with God. And guess what? You can have one too. You should have one. Yes. And so if we're not striving for that level of revelation, that level of miracle, we're really selling ourselves short as Mormons.
Absolutely. I love that you said that. And I when I was on my mission, I read Nephi's account of the tree of life. And I just completely fell in love with that idea. He says, the angel comes, he says, what do you want to see? And he says, I want to know what my father saw. Well, do you believe your father saw it? Well, that's kind of a dumb question. What the heck am I doing? Summoning you out of heaven, asking you questions. Of course, that's what I want to see, But it really stuck with me. And then when he talks to Laman and Lemuel, he doesn't say, you guys are lame because you never pray. They said the Lord chose no such things unto us. I mean, these were sons of the prophet. They weren't saying we don't know how to say family prayer. We don't know how to say grace over meal. They're saying we don't get revelation like that. And Nephi's response is to say, that's because you're wicked and you're hard in your heart, and you need to repent. He doesn't say, well, I'm going to be the new prophet, and so you need to follow me. You need to hang your laurels on me because I will receive revelation for you. Never you dare worry. He's saying you're wicked because you are not having the heavens opened. And Joseph Smith, when he says God will not hasn't shown anything to me or Brother Brigham that he won't show unto you, he's saying that at a time of his life, he's had some pretty massive experiences. Yeah. I mean, forget the first vision alone. I mean, he's had some pretty massive experiences on every level. And then there's the Moroni 7 thing that says, if you're not experiencing these miracles, woe unto you. But the thing that I loved about Joseph, and that I don't see in modern Mormonism, even in fundamentalism a lot of time, is Joseph was saying, I get these experiences because I want them. And guess what? God loves you just as much as he does me, and he'll give you the same experiences. And if you don't believe that, he'll give them to Brigham too, the same ones as Brigham. This is for you. This isn't for us to say, wow, Joseph is awesome, and I sure wish I was like him. He's saying, you can be like me. I'm not this unsurmountable goal. I'm not this ethereal, heroic, mythical man. I am a normal man just like you. Brigham Young, one of my favorite quotes is Brigham Young. He said, I feel like rejoicing and singing hallelujah every time I think of the prophet Joseph, that I knew him. But the context is he's saying Joseph did some really dumb things, and he was a fallible human being. And I thought, if God could work with somebody like that, then maybe there was a chance for me too. And all of those principles is echoing what you just said. I have for a long time in my life, and I usually don't kind of throw this out there, but since you said it, I just want to say hearty amen to that. I have for a long time in my life, I will stop and say, when was the last time that I had a spiritual experience? And I'm not saying I felt the Spirit Sunday school. I'm saying gift of tongues. I'm saying vision. I'm saying angelic visitation. I'm saying heavens opened. I'm saying whatever. My daughter being healed of several life-threatening conditions. My other daughter being bitten by a brown recluse and having her muscles missing and flesh torn out because of the venom, and growing it back by the next morning after a blessing. How often, when was the last time I had an experience like that? And if my answer was, gosh, it's been 6 to 8 months, then my thought isn't, oh, well, I'm just an average normal Mormon having my Mormon experience. My thought is, I should probably repent of something. What's my problem? Those, like you're saying, those are some of the best fruits that we're meant to have. Men are that they are to have, that they might have joy. That's the joy. It's those spiritual experiences. It's that spiritual fruit. And if you're not having them, you're missing out. And that's not to say I'm saying those people are wicked. I'm saying they're missing out. There's fruit offered to them, and they're not partaking. And it's a sad thing for them, because they can have it. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to obey every single 562 commandments that they can find and check it off on their list. God just says, I just want you to love me and try hard. And if you're doing your best, I'm going to bless you. If you have faith, ask. If you haven't seen somebody healed of cancer, you haven't lived yet. If you haven't seen somebody speak in tongues, you haven't lived yet. If you haven't interpreted tongues, you haven't lived yet. Let me show you the joys of the gospel. It isn't just to argue about whether or not Council 50 happened to have the last charge on March 23rd or 26th or April 17. It started December 23rd in a Quorum of Anointed meeting with Bathsheba Smith recording it, and it ended probably a couple days before he died on his way to Carthage. That's a 6-month period of time that he was preaching these things to the saints. So we can argue about that, but have you had a vision recently? Has God answered your prayers? Has he healed somebody for you? Has he changed somebody dramatically in their heart and saved them from horrible depression, and now they're happy? Whatever. It doesn't matter what the miracle is. That's for the individual. But that's the whole core of the gospel. And that's what we should be. That's what this is all about. It's not just the detail of what date did that happen again? Oh, you got it wrong. There were 4 people who testified that, not 3. Stupid academic,
Right.
That's anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, when do you think those books will come out, Drew?
I am hoping, and I'm horrible at this detail, but I am hoping that I will at least have for pre-order available the Last Charge and Transfiguration book by Thanksgiving.
Nice.
I'm that close. If not, it'll be like pre-order for Christmas, and dang it, at least Amazon does print on demand, and
as long as it's before Christmas. So let me tell you, I am the most predictable man in the world. every year for Christmas, it's like, get the old man some books, right? I got older kids now. I'm like, just load me up. I'm good. So as long as you got those bad boys ready, you know, a couple weeks before Christmas,
Right.
we're going to be good, Drew. So, well, dude, this was awesome. I had such a good time.
Likewise. Thank you.
Would you mind coming back on? Because, man, I feel like I could pick your brain about history for a long time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I have a really big weakness, and sometimes I feel like, gosh, I'm kind of neglecting my family. But you know, I had before I moved from Missouri, I had on multiple occasions people just pop up and spend like 4 hours just talking the gospel with me, and I'm like, dang, I didn't get this thing got done. But boy, I sure feel happy now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd love to. I'm always open to chatting about gospel stuff, and I think dialogue is super, super important. And frankly, not being part of a group presently, that's something that I'm missing. So
Yep.
yeah,
Absolutely. Well, let's do this again, because I love talking to you, man. Let's do this again.
likewise. Sounds great. Yeah,
Awesome.
I'd love to.
All right.
Let me say one quick thing for your
bet.
listeners. I've kept up with Adam God Teachings, and if you buy my book or have a copy of it and want to know what has changed since 2005, I've got like a 4-page document. It's all that I've found, and people have found for me and given to me type thing of updated quotes. And I give that free to anybody who wants to email me. It's just my name, Drew Briney @gmail. I have a website, Forgotten Mormon Teachings, and I've got free stuff on there. It's dead right now. But if you'd like to know more about D&C 76, the poetic version, and how it compares to the original and an annotated version, I've got a free version of that. If it's not online, hit me with an email. I'm happy to turn those things out. It doesn't cost anything. They're just PDFs, but you print them out for 100 pages or whatever it is, and really amazing stuff. And it's I'll probably publish it eventually, but until then, it's free to anybody who'd like stuff.
Awesome. Do me a favor, when your website gets back online, let me know, because I'll announce that on the podcast as well.
Okay, sounds great. I don't even know why it's down, so I'm just like hoping on my backups are strong.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
well, dude, like I said, this was awesome. I'm serious. Let's do this again. And I tell all my guests, you've been on once, you have a standing invitation to come back on. So if you come up with something that you think, Dave, this is awesome, I'd love to talk about this, you tell me and we'll make the time.
All right. Sounds
all right.
fabulous.
Sounds good. Bye, everybody.
Thanks a lot. God bless. Take care.